The outlaw didn't even flinch when he pulled the trigger the second time. He stood over a woman already crumpled in the dirt beside the overturned stagecoach, her hands raised, her mouth still forming the word please. And he shot her anyway. Not because she was a threat, not because she'd fought back, because she'd seen his face. That was enough. He stepped over her body the way a man steps over a log on a trail, reloaded without hurrying, and called back to his crew. Anyone still breathing? Finish it. He never looked toward the river. He never saw the young woman in the blue dress get torn away by the current before his bullet could find her. That was his only mistake, and it would cost him everything. If this kind of story, raw, real, and unforgettable, is what you've been looking for, subscribe to this channel right now so you never miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me the city or country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's begin. The Blackstone River didn't care about any of them. It didn't care about the overturned stagecoach lying half submerged on the western bank, its wheels still spinning uselessly in the current. It didn't care about the luggage scattered across the rocks, or the letters floating face down in the shallows, or the dark shapes of people who would never move again. The river just kept moving, cold and indifferent, carrying everything downstream: broken wood, torn fabric, and one young woman who was still impossibly alive. Vivian Mercer didn't know she was alive. Not exactly. She knew she was cold. She knew something was dragging at her legs and something else was slamming against her ribs every few seconds. She knew there was noise, a roaring that might have been the water or might have been the inside of her own skull. She'd stopped being able to tell the difference somewhere around the time she went under the third time. She didn't remember the shot that grazed her temple. She didn't remember the moment the current caught her skirt and yanked her sideways off the embankment while the man with the scarred jaw was still raising his rifle. She didn't remember the cold hitting her like a wall, or the way the river took her immediately, hungrily, pulling her down into a darkness that felt almost peaceful compared to what had just happened on that road. What she remembered, what kept surfacing through the blackness like something she couldn't fully drown, was the sound of the woman in the green coat screaming, and then the shot, and then nothing. Her fingers found mud before her mind understood what her fingers were doing. The bank was steep on the eastern side of the river, but a long flat shelf of silt had built up around a bend where a fallen cottonwood tree had slowed the current for years. The tree was still there, massive and rotting, and Vivian's arm caught it without intention, without strategy, purely because the river had put her exactly there, and her body still had one reflex left that hadn't surrendered yet. She held on. The current pulled. She held on harder. Her fingers dug into the bark until 3 of her nails tore backward, and she didn't feel it. She pulled herself along the trunk inch by inch, and by the time she reached the bank, she had nothing left. She crawled 2 body lengths onto the mud and stopped because stopping was the only option her body was willing to offer. Her cheek pressed into the cold earth. She could see the last thin strip of orange on the horizon, where the sun was finishing its business with this particular day. She thought, someone needs to know what happened. Then she thought nothing at all. Silas Granger had no reason to be out by the river at that hour. He'd already done the evening check on the east fence line, already brought the 2 horses in from the south pasture, already started a fire. He didn't particularly need because the evening was mild enough without one. But the fire felt right. And sometimes on quiet evenings when the ranch felt less like home and more like the place he'd ended up, Silas found himself walking without much intention, just to have his boots on something that wasn't his own porch. He was 34 years old and had been working this particular stretch of Wyoming frontier for 6 years. Before that, 2 years drifting after the war, and before that, well, he didn't go to before that much anymore. The ranch was 160 acres of decent grazing land, a solid cabin he'd built mostly himself, 2 horses, a mule he didn't entirely trust, and approximately no neighbors close enough to borrow sugar from. That last part had always suited him fine. He had a lantern because the walk back would be dark, not because he expected to find anything. He wasn't looking. His eyes were on the cottonwood tree line to the south, thinking about whether the east fence post near the creek crossing needed replacing before fall, when he almost walked into her. He stopped. He brought the lantern up. She was face down in the mud at the river's edge. Small, still. Her dress was dark with water, her hair plastered across her face and neck. One arm stretched forward as if she'd been reaching for something when she stopped moving. He stood there for 3 full seconds, doing nothing because his mind was performing the slow and unpleasant calculation between drowned and not drowned yet, and he wasn't certain which answer he was about to find. He crouched down beside her and pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck. A pulse. Thin as thread, but there. "All right," he said quietly, to himself or to her or to neither. He set the lantern in the mud and got his hands under her. She was heavier than she looked. Waterlogged clothes, he supposed, and completely limp, which made the lift awkward. He got her up against his chest, and she made a sound. Not a word, not even close to a word, but a sound, something between a groan and an exhale, and it told him she was closer to the surface than he'd thought. "You're safe now," he said. He didn't plan it. It came out automatically, the kind of thing you say to a spooked horse when you're not sure if it's going to kick you or collapse. He started walking. The thing about Martha Ellison was that she didn't waste words on surprise. She was 61 years old, had been delivering babies and stitching up cowboys and setting broken bones across 3 counties for close to 20 years, and when Silas Granger arrived at her door at nearly full dark, carrying a soaking, unconscious, half-dead young woman, Martha looked at the situation for about 2 seconds, stepped back, and said, "Bring her in and put her on the table." That was it. No, where did she come from? Or good Lord, what happened? Or is this any business of yours, Silas? Just table. Silas laid Vivian down and stepped back while Martha worked, and he stood in the corner of that small room feeling large and useless in the specific way that competent people feel when they are in the presence of someone more competent than themselves. He watched Martha check her pulse, check her breathing, peel back the matted hair to find the wound at her temple, a shallow gouge, but it had bled dramatically, and begin a systematic examination that moved with the economy of someone who had done this exact thing, or something close to it, many times before. "This wound isn't from the river," Martha said without looking up. "No," Silas said. "Not a fall, either." Martha's voice was steady. "This is a graze. Something fast and something close." She looked at him then. "You find her alone?" "At the river, mud bank about a mile east." "Nobody with her?" "Nobody." Martha looked at the wound for another moment. Then somebody left her there and assumed the job was finished. She reached for her kit. "Go heat water, the big pot. And while you're doing it, think about whether you want to know what you're getting yourself into." Silas went to heat the water. He thought about it. By the time the pot was ready, he'd arrived at the conclusion that he was already in it, whether he wanted to be or not. He sat in the chair outside Martha's door for most of the night. He didn't sleep. The chair was hard, and the night was cool, and he wasn't exactly a man who slept easily in unfamiliar circumstances, which this certainly qualified as. Around midnight, Martha came out and told him the fever had spiked, and she'd been able to get some broth down the woman's throat, but the next few hours were going to tell the real story. Around 2 o'clock, she came out again and said the fever had broken slightly, and she thought they'd probably keep her, which was Martha's way of saying she'd live. Around 4 in the morning, Silas heard the voice. It was weak and confused and came through the door like something caught in a fence. Not quite a sentence, not quite a cry. He was on his feet before he'd consciously decided to stand. Martha was already inside, sitting on the edge of the cot with her hand on the young woman's wrist. Vivian's eyes were open. Not focused exactly, but open, scanning the ceiling and the walls with the expression of someone who doesn't know if what they're seeing is real. "You're in Carver's Bend," Martha said. "You're safe. You're not in the river." Vivian's eyes moved to Martha's face. Something in them sharpened. "Not all the way? Not yet. But enough." "The others," she said. Her voice was barely there. Martha glanced at Silas. A brief communicating look. "Don't worry about that yet," Martha said. "The woman in the green coat." Vivian tried to sit up and Martha put a firm hand on her shoulder. There was a child. There was a little boy sitting behind the driver, and you need to rest. They shot them." Her voice broke on it, not dramatically, just the simple break of something that had been held carefully and finally couldn't be held anymore. They weren't even fighting back. Nobody was fighting back. Silas stood in the doorway and didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. "The man with the scar," Vivian said. Her eyes closed for a moment and then opened again, fighting toward clarity. He had a scar across the left side of his jaw, dark hair, tall. He gave the orders. She swallowed. I need someone to know that in case I... You're not going anywhere, Martha said firmly, and I've heard you. The information isn't going anywhere either. She looked over her shoulder at Silas. Go get the sheriff in the morning, first light. Silas nodded. Vivian's eyes found him in the doorway. She looked at him for a long moment, this tall, quiet stranger in someone else's house, watching her from across a room. And she said, You found me. Yes. She seemed to be working through the implications of that. Why did you bring the lantern? He wasn't sure what to do with that question. It was going to get dark. She looked at him a beat longer, and something in her expression shifted. Not gratitude exactly, though that was in there, more like recalibration. Like she was adjusting to the fact that the world, which had just tried very hard to end her, had produced one person who had been in the right place with a lantern. Okay, she said finally. It sounded less like thank you and more like noted. Then her eyes closed, and this time they stayed closed. Sheriff Elias Boone arrived before 8 the next morning, and Silas didn't particularly like what he saw. Boone was 53, heavy-set, and had the look of a man who had been doing a job long enough to know exactly how bad things could get before anyone in authority did anything about it. He was competent, Silas believed that. He was also, at this moment, sitting across Martha's kitchen table with his hat in his hands and the expression of someone delivering news he'd rather leave at the door. The Whitmore stage, he said. Left Dalton's Creek 3 days ago. 9 passengers plus the driver and the guard. He looked at Silas, then at the closed door to the back room. We found what was left of it yesterday morning. Somebody spotted the wreck from the ridge. The wheels were still in the water. Silas kept his voice level. How many? Boone turned his hat brim through his hands. Driver's dead. Guard's dead. We found 7 passengers on the bank or nearby. All of them. He stopped, started again. Nobody survived, far as we can tell. Except, he nodded toward the closed door. She remembers the face of at least one of them, Silas said. Boone's expression shifted into something careful. She told you that. She told Martha. I was in the doorway. And she gave a description? Scar on the left jaw, dark hair, the one giving orders. Boone was quiet for a moment. He set his hat on the table. All right, that's a problem. It's a problem for her, Silas said. It's a problem for everybody. Boone rubbed the back of his neck. These weren't random road agents, Silas. Somebody planned this. Somebody knew that stage was carrying... He stopped himself. There are some details I'm not going to put on the table right now. What I will tell you is that the men responsible have resources, and they will be very motivated to ensure there's nobody left who can identify any of them. Silas looked at the closed door. I've sent a wire to the federal marshals, Boone continued. They'll send someone, but it'll take time, a week, maybe more. He leaned forward. Right now, the only people who know she survived are you, me, and Martha. I'd like to keep that circle exactly that small for as long as possible. What are you asking? Boone met his eyes. I'm asking if you'd be willing to let her recover at your place. It's isolated. Nobody comes out that far without a reason. And, he paused, you're not somebody who talks. It wasn't precisely a compliment. Silas understood it as one anyway. She needs at least another week before she can be moved safely, Martha said from the doorway. She had materialized there silently, which was a thing Martha did without apparent effort. Probably closer to 2. The head wound is the concern. I don't want her on horseback or in a wagon before I'm satisfied she won't take a turn. Silas looked at Boone. Boone looked at Silas. I'll need to come back for a second chair, Silas said. He brought the wagon the next day, and Martha packed Vivian into it with enough blankets and stern instructions to keep her regiment in line. Vivian sat up for the ride, which Martha had argued against, and Vivian had argued for with the quiet, immovable firmness of someone who has made up their mind without particularly caring whether you agree. She won. She didn't talk much on the ride. The landscape was open and wide, rolling grass, the dark line of the mountains to the west, a sky that had no interest in being anything other than enormous. And she watched it with an expression Silas couldn't read. Not fear exactly, not peace either. Somewhere between the two, like a person taking stock of something large. How far? She said, about halfway. Another hour. She nodded, looked at the mountains. Do you get much trouble out this way? Some, not more than most places. She turned to look at him then, directly, in the way she had a tendency to do, without the social softening that most people applied to looking at strangers. It wasn't rude, it was just direct. You live alone? Yes. You don't mind? He considered that. Sometimes. She seemed to accept that as an honest answer. She turned back to the landscape. I've never been this far west before, she said. I was going to teach school in Ridgecrest. A pause. I suppose that's still the plan. There was something in I suppose that carried a lot of weight, though she said it lightly enough. Silas didn't press on it. When the ranch came into view, the cabin, the barn, the fenced pasture with the 2 horses lifting their heads to watch the wagon arrive, he heard her exhale slowly. It's quiet, she said. Mostly. Good. She said it like a woman who had recently had enough noise to last her a considerable time. The first 3 days were the hardest. The fever came back on the second night, and Silas sat up with her because there was nobody else to, and he was not going to leave her alone with it. He'd done some rough nursing in his time. The war had provided ample opportunity to learn which he'd have gladly traded. And he knew the rhythm of a bad night, the restlessness, the confused talking, the moments where a person surfaced enough to be frightened and then went back under before you could reassure them of anything. She talked during the fever. Not in sentences exactly, more in fragments. She said a name, Eleanor, several times with an urgency that was painful to hear. She said stop once, sharp and loud enough that he instinctively reached for the rifle before he understood what was happening. She said, at one point, in a voice that was completely clear and completely unlike the fever voice, I should have been in the front seat, and then went quiet for a long time. He didn't know what that meant. He didn't ask. By the 3rd morning, the fever had broken properly, and she lay in his bed. He'd taken the barn, which was warmer than it sounded, looking at the ceiling with the alert but depleted expression of someone who has been fighting hard for days and has finally, temporarily, won. He brought her broth. She sat up to drink it. You were up last night, she said. It wasn't a question. You had a rough night. She looked at the cup in her hands. Did I say anything? Nothing worth repeating. She glanced at him, that direct look again, like she was checking whether he was being kind or honest or both. Then she went back to the broth. I'm not usually like that, she said. Fevers. I didn't assume you were. She drank. He stood there with nothing useful to do, which was a familiar sensation at this point. Thank you, she said finally. Not elaborated, not surrounded by apology or excess. Just the 2 words, placed carefully. You're welcome, he said, and meant it the same way. By the end of the first week, she was on her feet for part of each day, moving carefully and not pushing harder than her body would honestly support, which, Silas suspected, was somewhat less than she wanted to push. She had the look of a woman accustomed to productivity, to having tasks and completing them, and enforced idleness sat poorly on her. She started noticing things. The hinge on that window is about to give, she said on the 6th day, sitting at the table with a mug of coffee she'd made herself because she'd asked where the coffee was, and he'd shown her and she'd made it. He looked at the window. She was right. I know. You have the hardware to fix it? In the barn. I'll do it, she said. He started to say something about her still recovering, read the look on her face, and changed course. I'll get the tools. She fixed the hinge. It took her longer than it would have taken him, and she had to sit down twice, and the 3rd time she sat down, she stayed down, but the hinge was right when she was finished, and she looked at it with the satisfaction of someone who needed the small victory more than she would ever say. She started helping with other things after that. Not the heavy work. She wasn't ready for that and seemed to know it. But the smaller daily things, cooking when he was out in the fields, mending the tears in the spare saddle blanket, reorganizing his supplies cabinet in a way that made a great deal more sense than the previous arrangement, though she had the tact not to say so out loud. They developed a rhythm. It wasn't discussed. It was just what happened when 2 capable people inhabited the same space for long enough, each filling in the gaps the other left without making a project of it. He noticed she read whenever she could find something to read, which on a working ranch in Wyoming was not as much as she'd have liked. He had 3 books, a surveying manual, an almanac from 1871, and a battered novel someone had left on the stage that had brought him here 6 years ago. She read the novel twice. He noticed this without comment, and on his next trip to town brought back 2 more books from the general store's small and dusty collection. She looked at them when he set them on the table without saying anything, and then she said, "The one with the red cover is actually quite good. I read it last winter." "I didn't know which ones you'd read." "No, obviously." She picked up the second book and looked at it. "I haven't read this one." A pause. "Thank you." The way she said it that time was slightly different than the first time, less careful, more like something that assumed a continuation. Wow. Boone came back at the end of the first week with his hat and his careful expression and the news that the federal marshals had been delayed and it would be at least another week, possibly 2. Vivian sat across the table from him and gave her account for the second time, organized, detailed, precise. She didn't stumble. She didn't soften the hard parts. She described the scarred man's instructions to his crew with the flat accuracy of someone determined to be useful, and she described the moments before she went into the river with the same flat accuracy, which Silas suspected cost her considerably more, but she didn't let it show. Boone wrote everything down. He asked clarifying questions, and she answered them without hesitation. When he was done, he folded his notebook and said, "You understand that as long as these men believe you're dead, you're safe. And the moment they learn otherwise—" "I understand," Vivian said. "Then you understand why we need to keep things quiet." "I said I understand." She met his eyes. "What I don't understand is why you look like you're waiting for me to fall apart." Boone blinked. Silas kept his face neutral. "I've given you everything I know," Vivian continued. "I intend to give it again in court if that's what it takes. I am not going to pretend I'm not frightened, because I am. But frightened and useless aren't the same thing, Sheriff." A silence settled across the table. Boone looked at her for a moment, and his expression, for just a moment, dropped the careful quality and became something more like respect. "No," he said, "they're not." He left with his notes and his horse and his promise that he'd be back when the marshals arrived, and Silas stood on the porch watching him go down the road until he disappeared into the tree line. "He means well," Vivian said from behind him. "He does. He just wasn't expecting—" She didn't finish the sentence. "What?" She leaned against the porch post. The afternoon light was hitting her face from the side, and she looked tired and resolute in equal measure. Somebody who was angry about it instead of just scared. Silas thought about that. "Are you angry?" She looked at the road where Boone had gone. "I am so angry," she said quietly, "that I have to be very careful where I put it." He understood that. He understood it more than he expected to. On the 9th day, she found him at the east fence, the one he'd been thinking about on the night he found her. He was replacing the post she'd already identified as compromised, which involved digging out the old one, and that was hard work on dry summer ground. She watched him for a moment, then she picked up the spare post and held it straight while he poured the mixed concrete footing, which she'd noticed was how he was setting them. He didn't tell her she didn't have to. She'd stopped responding well to being told what she didn't have to do. They worked through the afternoon, the 2 of them. The conversation was minimal, but it wasn't absent. She asked about the property, the fence lines, the water source. He answered and sometimes asked things back. She'd grown up in Ohio, school teacher's daughter herself, had gotten the teaching certificate 2 years ago and been saving for the Western posting because she wanted— She paused, chose her words. She wanted to be somewhere that was still becoming something, where things weren't already settled. He said he understood that. She looked at him sideways. "I think you do," she said. Not like a conclusion, more like something she'd just worked out. The sun was going down by the time the last post was set. She sat on the fence rail, carefully, testing it first, and looked west at the mountains, which were doing the thing mountains did at that hour, turning the kind of purple that doesn't have a good name. "I want to stay through the trial," she said. "When the marshals come and set up the proceedings. I'm not running somewhere else to hide while someone else handles it. I want to be the one who looks him in the face in a courtroom." She said it evenly, without theatrics. "Is that going to be a problem?" Silas leaned on the fence post and thought about that. "I'll talk to Boone." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. "No," he said. "It's not going to be a problem." She nodded, looked back at the mountains. "Good." They stood there together until the mountains lost their color and the first stars came up, and then they went back to the cabin for dinner, and neither of them commented on how natural it was to walk back side by side, the way people do when they've spent a productive day on the same piece of land. But on the 10th night, Silas woke to the sound of a horse, not on the road, not approaching from the front. A horse moving slowly through the south pasture, which was the long way around, which was the way you came if you didn't want anyone to hear you coming down the main road. He was out of his bunk in the barn with his rifle before the sound registered as fully as it should. He stood in the dark and listened, and the horse, or whatever animal it was, moved once more and then was still. He waited. Nothing else. He did a slow circle of the property, taking his time, checking the cabin, the barn perimeter, the south fence line. Nothing. No tracks in the soft ground near the creek that he could see clearly in the moonlight. No sign of anyone at the road. He stood by the front porch for a long time, listening to the way the night sounded when it was only itself. Crickets, the creek, the usual settling sounds of the barn. He tried to decide if he'd heard what he thought he'd heard, and concluded that either he had, in which case someone had been careful enough to leave no evidence, or he hadn't, in which case this place was getting to him in a way it hadn't gotten to him in 6 years. He went back to the barn. He didn't sleep again until almost dawn. At breakfast, he told Vivian there was a possibility someone had been on the property last night, and she went very still over her coffee and then looked up at him with that steady look and said, "You're sure?" "Not entirely, but enough to mention it." Enough to mention it. She put down the cup and was quiet for a moment. Then, "What do we do?" "I'm going to ride into town today and tell Boone to move up the timeline on the marshals. We can't wait 2 more weeks." She nodded. Her hands were flat on the table and she was looking at the space between them. "And if whoever it was comes back before the marshals get here, they won't find what they're looking for," he said. She looked up at him. "This ranch has more places to not be found than it looks like from outside," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "You've thought about this." "I've thought about a lot of things since you got here." He didn't say it with any weight behind it. It was simply true. She seemed to receive it as simply true because she nodded and said, "All right," in the tone of someone who has decided to trust a specific person to a specific degree and intends to honor that decision. He rode for town. And 30 yards into the tree line, just at the bend where the road curved south, he found the hoof prints. 2 horses, standing still for a while, pointed toward the ranch. Recent. He sat in his saddle and looked at them for a long moment, and then he pushed his horse to a canter and didn't stop until he reached Boone's office door. Boone was already in a bad mood when Silas walked through the door, which told Silas that something had happened before he arrived, and that his news was going to make it considerably worse. The sheriff was standing behind his desk with the telegraph paper in his hand, reading it, the way a man reads something he wishes said something different. He looked up when the door opened, registered Silas's expression, and set the paper down with the careful deliberateness of someone who has decided to deal with one problem at a time. "Tracks," Silas said. 2 horses, south bend of the road, pointed at the ranch. Recent. From last night or close to it. Boone picked the telegraph paper back up. "I know." Silas stopped. "What do you mean you know?" "I mean, someone else already knew she survived." Boone set the paper on the desk and turned it so Silas could read it. "This came in this morning from the marshal's office in Cheyenne. One of their informants inside the gang passed word 2 days ago. The man giving orders that day, the one she described, his name is Garrett Crow." Silas read the name on the paper. It didn't mean anything to him. "And he's not a road agent from out of territory." Boone sat down heavily. "Garrett Crow runs about 400 acres 12 miles northwest of your place. Been there 3 years, pays his taxes, attends town meetings, bought a round at the saloon twice last winter." He looked at Silas steadily. "You know him." Silas stood very still. He did know him. Not well. The man had come by once to discuss a shared water access point on the northern creek, had been pleasant enough, offered a handshake and a reasonable position, and left without trouble. Silas had filed him under decent neighbor and thought about him approximately never since. He felt something shift in his chest, not quite nausea, more like the specific discomfort of realizing you miscounted something important. "He's been asking questions," Boone continued, "subtly, 2 people in town mentioned it to me in the last 3 days without knowing they were doing it. Just mentioning that Garrett Crow had been chatty, asking if anyone seen unusual traffic on the eastern roads, whether there'd been any news about the Whitmore wreck. Friendly conversation, that's how he does it. He leaned back. And 12 miles is close enough to have a man watching your property overnight. Or to come himself, Silas said. Or to come himself. The silence in the office had weight to it. Outside, someone drove a wagon past the window, and the ordinary sound of it felt almost absurd. How long until the marshals? Silas said. I pushed hard this morning before you came. Earliest is 5 days. Boone picked up a pen and put it down again. I need you to go back to that ranch and stay there. Don't vary your routine in a way that signals anything's wrong. If Crow or anyone connected to him comes by with friendly questions, you answer them exactly the way a man would who hasn't got a secret. And Vivian. She stays invisible. Boone's voice was firm. Nobody comes to that door, nobody sees her, nobody even has reason to think there's more than one person living there. Can you manage that? Silas thought about the woman who had fixed his hinge and reorganized his supply cabinet and sat on the fence rail watching the mountains turn purple. She's going to want to know everything I just heard. She can know it. She's earned it. Just keep her inside and keep her quiet. Telling Vivian Mercer to keep quiet, Silas said, is going to go about as well as you'd expect. Boone almost smiled. It didn't quite make it, but it tried. Then tell her to be strategically silent. She strikes me as a woman who understands strategy. He pushed the horse harder on the way back than was strictly sensible and arrived at the ranch to find Vivian on the porch with the almanac and a coffee that had gone cold. She looked up when he came through the gate and read something in the way he was riding that brought her to her feet before he'd even dismounted. Tell me, she said. He tied the horse and did. All of it. Garrett Crow, the proximity, the questions around town, the timeline on the marshals. He kept his voice level and watched her face go through several things in quick succession. Recognition, something sharp and cold, and then the controlled stillness that he was starting to understand was what she looked like when she was most frightened. He lives 12 miles away, she said. Yes. And you've met him? Once. She looked at the road. Not like she expected someone to come down it immediately, but the way a person looks at something they've suddenly recategorized. That's why the horses last night. He wasn't sending someone to check. He came himself. He wanted to see the property, see the layout. She pressed her lips together. He's careful. He's had 3 years to be careful, Silas said, which means he's good at it. She turned back. The controlled stillness cracked slightly, not into panic, into something harder and more focused. I need to give Boone a better description, not just the scar and the hair color. His hands, he wore a ring on the right hand, wide band, silver or pewter. He had a voice that... She stopped. I heard him before I saw him. He was talking to someone and laughing, and the laugh was wrong. Not mean exactly, absent. Like the situation was mildly interesting, but not worth real attention. She looked at Silas. That's what I remember most, that he was bored by it. Silas took that in. Write it down. Everything, whatever you remember, write it down today, because if something goes sideways before the marshals get here, I want that information somewhere besides your head. She nodded once, already moving toward the door. Then she stopped. What did Boone say about the 5 days? He said stay invisible. She turned back to look at him. There was a particular expression she had, he'd seen it twice now, where she was working through whether to say something or swallow it. This time she said it. He also told you to keep me quiet. He suggested strategic silence. And you relayed that to me. I told you what Boone said. I'm not in the business of telling you what to do. She studied him for a moment. Something in her expression shifted. Not softer exactly, but differently arranged. All right, she said. Then I'll be strategically silent. A pause. After I write everything down. That was already the plan, he said. She wrote for most of the afternoon, filling 8 pages with a handwriting that was small and precise and covered every detail she'd retained from the day of the attack. The position of each man she'd seen, the sequence of events as she understood them, the physical descriptions she could piece together, the words she'd heard spoken. She wrote the name Garrett Crow at the top of the 4th page and drew a line through what she remembered of his voice, his hands, his ring, the specific quality of his indifference. Silas read it when she was done and didn't say anything for a long time. "This is going to put him away," he said. "That's the point. I mean, it's detailed enough that he knows it, knows what you could say if you got to a courtroom." He set the pages down carefully, which is part of why he's not waiting. She'd already reached the same conclusion. He could see it in the way she received the statement, not as new information, but as confirmation. "How many men does he have?" Boone doesn't know for certain. The gang has at least 8 riders based on witness accounts from 2 previous robberies they're now connecting to the same group. Not all of them live locally. He paused. Some of them are just hired. "For jobs," she said flatly. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the evening wind was picking up, running through the grass in long, slow waves. The window in the kitchen, the one with the hinge she'd fixed, rattled once and settled. "Tell me about the property," she said. "The parts I haven't seen. You said there were places to not be found." He told her about the root cellar beneath the kitchen floor. The hatch was under the braided rug, and the cellar itself ran back 8 feet and had a ventilation gap near the foundation that opened to the east side of the cabin. He told her about the dry creek bed to the north that ran through the property and provided natural cover all the way to the tree line. He told her about the secondary route to the road, barely a track anymore, that came out through the east pasture gate rather than the main entrance. She listened to all of it, asked 2 questions. How deep was the cellar? Was there water access from the dry creek bed? And he answered both. She was building the property ahead, he realized. Mapping it. Not because she was planning to run, but because she didn't like being in a place she didn't understand. "The hatch," she said. "Can it be secured from inside?" "There's an iron bracket, drops into a slot." "Good." She looked at the rug, then at him. "I'm not going to spend 5 days sitting in a cellar, Silas. I didn't ask you to. But if something happens, I go there first." "If something happens," he said, "you go there before I ask you to, not after." She held his gaze. Agreed. The next 2 days passed with an unusual quality, tense beneath the surface but ordinary on top, the way river water looks calm before you notice how fast it's actually moving. Silas kept to his routines with deliberate care, morning checks on the animals, fence work in the afternoon, smoke from the chimney at the usual hours. Nothing that said something's different here. He'd been trained in that kind of ordinariness once, years ago, and the skill came back with uncomfortable ease. Vivian stayed inside during the daylight hours and didn't complain about it. She cooked, she read. She went through the supplies cabinet she'd already organized and began taking a quiet inventory, which Silas understood after a moment to mean she was calculating how long they could sustain themselves without a trip to town. When he checked her numbers that evening, they were accurate. On the second afternoon, Garrett Crow rode up the front road. Silas was at the barn when he heard the horse, and he recognized the gelding before he recognized the rider, a big bay quarter horse, clean-legged, good-bred, the kind of animal that cost real money. Crow pulled up at the fence and raised a hand, and Silas walked to meet him with every muscle in his back deciding simultaneously to tighten. Crow was a tall man, mid-40s, broad in the shoulders with a face that was arranged pleasantly enough in the way faces are when their owner has spent considerable effort arranging them. He had dark hair going gray at the temples and a wide jaw, and across the left side of that jaw, partially obscured by a week's worth of deliberate scruff, was a scar. Not prominent, not the kind of thing that drew immediate attention, the kind of thing you'd note if you were looking and miss entirely if you weren't. Silas had met him once. He hadn't been looking. "Granger," Crow said. His voice was easy, conversational. "Thought I'd ride over, check on things. Heard there was some trouble on the eastern road, that stage wreck. Pretty ugly business." "I heard," Silas said. "You're far enough out you might not have noticed traffic." Crow leaned on his saddle horn, comfortable, relaxed. "Anyone come through your property? Strangers passing through? Anything like that?" Silas looked up at him with the expression he'd been wearing since he was 19 years old and wanted people to read nothing in his face. "Not that I noticed," he said, "though I'm not always watching the road." "No, course not." Crow looked around the property with the easy air of someone admiring the scenery. His eyes moved across the cabin, the barn, the east pasture, and came back to Silas. "You're out here alone mostly, right? No ranch hand?" "Just me." "Smart. Less overhead." He smiled. It was a good smile. the kind that looked comfortable in a face. Well, if you see anything unusual, you might pass word to Boone. They're saying the men who hit that stage are still in the area. That's so, Silas said. That's what I'm hearing. Crow straightened in his saddle, gathering his reins. Might want to keep your doors locked at night. Precautionary. He said it pleasantly, without edge. The way a neighbor says it might rain, bring your washing in. I'll keep that in mind, Silas said. You do that. Crow tipped his hat, turned the bay horse, and rode back down the road at a comfortable walk. Not hurrying, not looking back. Silas stood at the fence until the sound of hooves faded, and then he went to the barn for 3 minutes to get his hands to stop shaking, and then he went inside. Vivian was standing 6 feet back from the kitchen window, where she could see the road at an angle without being visible from outside. She had a kitchen knife in her right hand, held low and down, which he doubted she'd thought about consciously. I saw, she said quietly. The scar, he said. Under the scruff. Left jaw. Her voice was completely even. That's him. He crossed to the table and sat down because his legs seemed interested in doing that. He was checking, making sure it was just me out here. And you gave him nothing. I gave him nothing. He put his hands flat on the table. But he's smart enough that nothing is still an answer. He'll be thinking about whether nothing is too much of nothing. She set the knife on the counter without comment. How long before he decides? I don't know him well enough to say. A day, maybe 2. He looked at her. We need to move up the timeline again. Boone. I'll go at first light tomorrow. He thought for a moment. I don't want to go tonight. I don't want to leave you here alone after dark with him thinking about the property. She nodded slowly. Her eyes moved around the cabin in the way they did when she was running calculations she didn't say out loud. I can manage one night. I know you can. I have the rifle. I'll leave both of them. He paused. You know how to use it? She gave him a look that said the question was mildly insulting, and she was choosing to let it pass. My father kept one for coyotes. I'm not a marksman, but I'm not helpless with it either. I didn't say helpless. The question implied it. He conceded that with a nod. I'll leave both rifles. He almost didn't go to town the next morning. He stood in the barn at dawn with the horse saddled and the light coming in through the gaps in the boards in long, thin lines. And he thought about what he'd be leaving and thought about what he needed from Boone and ran the calculation 4 times and came out the same way each time. He needed Boone to send a wire directly to the marshal's office and push for an immediate response. 5 days had become insufficient. If Crow decided in the next 48 hours that a witness probably existed and was probably close, 5 days would be 4 days too many. He went in and told Vivian he'd be back before noon. I'll be fine, she said, from the table where she was eating breakfast with her back straight and her hands steady and the look on her face of someone who intends to be fine through sheer determination if necessary. He believed her. That wasn't the issue. If anyone comes to the door, don't open it, he said. Call out, say you'll pass word to me, and come get me when I'm back. She looked at him. And if it's not someone who waits for a door to open? Cellar, he said, before you hear them on the porch. She nodded. He rode. He made it to town in 40 minutes and had Boone at his desk with the telegraph form in hand in 45. He relayed Crow's visit, the observation about the scar, and the 2-day window he estimated they had before the situation deteriorated from tense to actively dangerous. Boone listened with the expression of a man revising his own timeline in real time. I'll wire Cheyenne now, Boone said. Priority status. They need to hear the witness has made a positive visual identification. He picked up a pen. That changes the legal picture considerably. A witness identifying a face is different from a witness describing a scar. She identified him. Silas said. Directly. No question. Boone wrote quickly. That's enough for an arrest warrant. Once I can get that in Cheyenne's hands. How long? If I send this now and they move immediately, Boone calculated. 48 hours for the wire responses. Marshal's writing from Cheyenne, another day. Best case, 60 hours from now we have official federal presence. Crow might not give us 60 hours. No, Boone said. He might not. He looked up. Is there anywhere else she can go? Someone else's property? Farther from his? Silas thought about it. Honestly. And arrived at the honest answer, which was no. Anywhere farther was also more exposed. more roads, more chance of being seen in transit. The ranch was isolated, but it was a known isolation, a defensible one, and moving Vivian now meant moving her through open country with a man who already had eyes on the eastern roads. "She stays where she is," he said. Boone didn't argue. He finished the wire and sent it and told Silas he'd send a deputy out that afternoon, a young man named Curtis who was capable and discreet. "Tell him to come through the east gate," Silas said, "not the main road." "I'll tell him, Dad." Curtis arrived at the ranch 2 hours after Silas got back, coming through the east pasture gate on a spotted gray horse and looking relieved to find the place quiet. He was 26, sandy-haired, with the kind of earnest competence that made people underestimate him in exactly the ways that were most useful for a lawman. Silas pointed him to the barn loft and told him to stay up there through the night and stay out of sight regardless of what he heard unless Silas specifically came to get him. Curtis nodded like this was a reasonable instruction, which Silas appreciated. Vivian met Curtis with a handshake and a directness that visibly startled him, then offered him coffee that he accepted, and that was the entirety of the social exchange. She was conserving something. Silas could see it. She'd been doing it since the afternoon before, rationing herself in some careful internal way, and he thought he understood it. When you're running on a reserve of controlled fear, you spend it carefully because you don't know when the need is going to spike. That night was quiet. Not comfortable. It wasn't that kind of quiet, but uneventful, which was all they needed it to be. Curtis kept watch from the barn loft. Silas checked the property twice in the night and found nothing disturbed. Vivian slept, which he knew because her lamp was out by 10 and didn't come back on. And he admitted to himself somewhere around 2 in the morning, paying more attention to the light under her door than was strictly required for security purposes. The third day arrived without incident and passed the same way, slowly and with the stretched quality of time that doesn't have enough to fill it. Silas worked. Vivian read and wrote and moved through the cabin with the particular restlessness of someone accustomed to purpose who has been temporarily denied it. She came out to the porch in the early evening, the most she'd allowed herself in daylight, and sat with her coffee and looked at the mountains. He sat in the second chair, the one he'd gone back to Martha's to retrieve. "Martha sent bread," he said, because he'd been meaning to mention it since the morning and kept forgetting. "It's on the counter. I saw it. I had some at lunch." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "How did Martha end up out here?" "Same way most people do. She came with a husband who didn't last, and she did." He paused. "She was already doing the healing work. The frontier just needed it more." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "That's a hard life." "She seems to think it suits her." "I think she's right." She looked at the road, then pulled her gaze back deliberately. "Do you regret it? Coming out here?" The question landed somewhere unexpected. He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think about things when they mattered. "No," he said. "There were years I thought I might, but no." "What changed?" He considered the answer. "I stopped waiting for it to feel like something I chose and started treating it like something I chose." He looked at her. "There's a difference." She turned to look at him with that direct attention she gave to things. "Yes," she said quietly. "There is." They sat with that for a while. The evening light moved across the grass, slow and broad, and the mountains did their end-of-day color change, and neither of them said anything, and it wasn't uncomfortable, which was its own kind of remarkable given everything surrounding that porch in every direction. Then Silas heard the sound. He was on his feet before his chair finished rocking back. Not a horse this time. Something else. Something deliberate and quiet at the south fence line. Something that had no business being there at this hour. He caught Vivian's eye and held up one finger and pointed at the door. She was inside before he reached the porch steps. He crossed the yard with the rifle already in his hand, moving away from the light, keeping the barn between himself and the south pasture. Curtis was already visible in the loft window, a shadow against the darker shadow of the barn interior, and Silas gave him the signal they'd established, 2 fingers, south direction, and watched him shift position accordingly. He moved along the fence line slowly, reading the ground in the fading light. There, 60 yards south, a shape that didn't belong to the fence posts or the brush, low, stationary, pressed against the fence where the grass grew tallest. A man, crouching and watching the cabin. Not Crow. Too slight for Crow. A younger man, a watcher, somebody's eyes. Silas came around behind him in the time it took the man to shift his weight and look the wrong direction. He pressed the rifle barrel to the back of the man's neck and said quietly, "Don't move your hands." The man froze. "Lace your fingers behind your head," Silas said. "Slow." The hands came up. Silas stepped back and to the side, keeping the rifle on him. "Stand up. Keep your hands where they are." The man stood. I was maybe 22, with a scared face that hadn't had enough time in it yet to be good at hiding how scared it was. He was carrying a pistol on his hip that Silas had already clocked, and a knife on the other side, and nothing else he could see. "Who sent you?" Silas said. The man said nothing. "I'm not going to ask again," Silas said. He kept his voice at the same level as before. Even. Patient. The voice of someone who has made a decision and is simply waiting for the other person to catch up. The young man's jaw worked. He looked at the rifle, looked at Silas's face, and found nothing in either that suggested the situation was going to improve if he stayed quiet. "Mr. Crow," he said to watch and count how many people came and went. "And what did you count?" The man hesitated. "You counted one person going to town and coming back," Silas said, "which means you were here before this morning. Where's your horse?" "Creek bed, north." "And is Mr. Crow planning to come back himself?" The young man's eyes moved slightly, involuntarily, toward the southwest. Just for a second, back quickly. But it was enough. Silas exhaled slowly through his nose. He wasn't coming from the northwest. Crow was already on his way from a different direction. He disarmed the young man and zip-tied his hands with the leather cord from his own belt and put him in the root cellar under the kitchen floor, not the one beneath the hatch, the smaller secondary storage off the pantry, and locked it with the hasp from outside. Then he stood in the kitchen and looked at the hatch under the braided rug. Vivian was standing in the doorway to the back room. She'd heard everything. Her face was white, but her voice, when she spoke, was steady. "He's coming. Soon," Silas said. "Tonight, most likely." She looked at the hatch, then at him. "Curtis?" "I'm going to him now." He moved toward the door, stopped, turned back. She needed to hear it clearly, so he said it clearly. "You go into that cellar and you put the bracket down and you don't come up until I open it myself. Not if you hear shouting, not if you hear shots, not if you hear my voice, because I might not be the one saying what I'd say. You wait until I open it." She held his gaze. "And if you don't open it? Then you wait until morning and you go out the ventilation gap east side and you run for the creek bed and you get to town." He paused. "But I'm going to open it." She looked at him for a long moment, the kind of looking that covers ground quickly and doesn't waste time on what can't be said. "All right," she said. She crossed to the rug and pulled it back and lifted the hatch. She looked at him once more from the edge of it, and he looked back. And then she went down, and the hatch closed, and he heard the bracket drop into the slot. He went to get Curtis. Outside, somewhere to the southwest, the sound of hooves was moving through the dark, getting louder, and there were more of them than one. The hooves stopped about 200 yards out. That was the first thing Silas registered as he crossed the yard to the barn at a low run. The sound had been getting closer, and then it quit, all at once, the way sound quits when something makes a decision. Not a gradual slowing, a stop. Which meant they'd reached a position they'd already chosen in advance, which meant Garrett Crow had been to this property before in his mind, many times before he came to it in person. Curtis was already down from the loft by the time Silas came through the barn door, rifle in hand, hat off, the particular alert stillness of a young man who has been waiting for exactly this and is now slightly terrified that it has arrived. "How many did you count?" Silas said quietly. "At least 4 horses. Maybe 5. Hard to tell from the sound." Curtis's voice was steady enough. "They stopped at the south tree line." "They'll split," Silas said. He was already thinking through the geometry of it, the cabin sitting in the approximate center of the cleared property, the barn to the east, the south pasture open and exposed, the north side where the dry creek bed ran offering the only natural cover that wasn't his own buildings. 1 or 2 to the north to cut off the creek, 1 or 2 around the east side to cover the barn and the secondary road, and Crow coming up the center or the west because that's where the front door is, and he's the kind of man who comes through the front door. Curtis absorbed that. "What do we do?" Silas thought about what they had. 2 rifles, 2 pistols between them, One deputy and one rancher against what was probably 5 men who had done this kind of work before. He thought about the cellar and Vivian with the bracket down and the ventilation gap she'd use if it went wrong. He thought about Boone's wire and whether the marshals in Cheyenne had moved yet, and concluded that counting on cavalry was not a plan, it was a hope. And hope needed a scaffold of something more solid to stand on. "The water trough," he said. "Near the south fence. Cast iron. You get behind that and you stay behind it until you have something worth shooting at. Don't fire until I fire first. I want to know how many and where before anyone gives away a position." Curtis nodded. "And if I go down," Silas said, "you're not going to help me. You're going to get to town and get Boone. That's your job." I'm not asking," Silas said. "That's the assignment. Say yes or go get in the cellar with the prisoner." Curtis looked at him, then said, "Yes." "Good." Silas moved to the barn door and looked at the dark between the buildings and the tree line and saw nothing yet, which didn't mean nothing was there. "Give it 2 minutes, then go low across the south yard. Don't cross any open ground you don't have to." Curtis went. Silas went the opposite direction. He worked around the north side of the cabin by feel, staying close to the walls, keeping his boots in the grass rather than the dirt path where footsteps carried differently. The creek bed was 30 yards out, and he could see the dark line of it against the lighter ground, and he could not yet see whether anyone was moving along it. He pressed himself against the north wall of the cabin and listened. For a long moment there was nothing. The night insects, the wind in the grass, the far-off sound of something that might have been an owl. And then, soft, deliberate, the sound of a man trying not to make sound, the brush and push of a body moving through long grass parallel to the creek, heading east, cutting off the secondary road exit, just like he'd said. One man, heading for the east gate. Silas let him go. One man at the east gate was a problem he could work backward from later. Right now the east gate was the exit he didn't need. And one man guarding a door no one was going to use was one man not standing in front of the door he did need. He moved to the corner of the cabin and looked south across the open yard. He saw them then. 2 shapes at the edge of the cleared ground, moving forward from the tree line with the careful, unhurried pace of men who believed they had the numbers to be patient. They were keeping low, using the fence posts as reference points, staying out of the direct line from the cabin windows. Professional enough. Not military. The spacing was wrong for military, but experienced. He counted. 2 on the south approach, 1 going east, which left at least 1 unaccounted for, and Crow himself. He pulled back from the corner. Crow would want to see the front first, would want to know what was moving inside the cabin. He'd stay back from the initial approach and assess, and when he thought the time was right, he'd either call out or come in, depending on what the assessment told him. That was what a man who'd been careful for 3 years did. He let other people absorb the uncertainty first, which meant Crow was somewhere on the west side watching the front windows. Silas went back inside through the back door. The cabin was dark, the way he'd left it. The lamp on the table had been turned down before he went to the barn, and from outside the windows would show the dull amber glow of a fire banked low. Ordinary, lived in, the kind of light that said one man reading or sleeping, nothing unusual. He crossed the kitchen without a lamp and crouched beside the front window and looked out at an angle through the gap between the curtain and the frame. There, 20 feet from the front porch, a shape standing in the dark between 2 fence posts, not moving, watching the windows. The posture was Crow's. The breadth of him, the way he stood without apparent tension because the tension was entirely internal, economized. The man was good at looking relaxed while he made decisions. He'd been good at it in the daylight too. Silas considered his options, which were fewer than he'd like and less clean than he preferred. He could stay inside. Let them come, fight from inside the cabin walls, which provided cover but also meant they'd light the place eventually. Fire being the oldest and most reliable method of removing people from structures they didn't want to exit. He could go out the front, which was where Crow expected him to emerge, and had presumably positioned accordingly. He could go out the back and try to work around west and come up on Crow from behind, which required crossing open ground without being seen by the 2 men on the south approach who were still moving toward the fence line. None of these were good options. What he had, instead of good options, was better information than Crow knew he had. He knew where they were. All 4 of them, close enough. And they didn't know he knew because the man in the secondary storage cellar hadn't had time to tell anyone anything. The information gap was temporary. Once Crow determined his watcher wasn't in position, the calculation would change. But it existed right now, for the next few minutes, and a few minutes was what Silas had to work with. He crossed to the table and picked up the spare lantern, the old tin one, not the good glass one, and turned it up high. Then he opened the back door, extended his arm around the frame, and set the lit lantern down in the dirt of the back step. Light bloomed out from the back of the cabin. He moved away from the back door immediately, going north through the kitchen and out the north side window he'd unlatched earlier in the evening, landing in the grass and rolling up to his feet and moving along the wall toward the west corner. He heard the south men react to the light. A brief exchange, barely audible, two voices. They'd report the light to Crow. Crow would think someone had gone out the back. It wouldn't fool him for more than 30 seconds, but 30 seconds was sometimes all a situation needed to rearrange itself. Silas came around the west corner low and fast, and he was within 10 feet of Crow before the man turned. Crow turned with the speed of someone whose instincts were genuinely good, and he had a gun in his hand before Silas got the rifle up. And for 2 full seconds they stood in the dark with their weapons on each other, and neither of them fired. "Put it down, Granger," Crow said. His voice was the same as it had been in the daylight. Easy. Almost reasonable. The voice of a man who genuinely believed the situation was going to resolve in his favor. "I don't want trouble with you specifically." "You rode to my property in the dark with 4 men, Silas said. "That seems like trouble specifically." "I'm looking for someone. A young woman who survived the stage wreck. I have reason to believe she's been sheltered here." He kept the gun level. His eyes, in the dark, were patient. "You hand her over. Nobody else gets hurt, including you." "There's no woman here." "I think you're lying." "You searched the property through a watcher. What did he see?" "He saw one man coming and going." A pause. "He didn't see her." "Which isn't the same as her not being there." Crow tilted his head slightly. "Where is he, incidentally? I expected him in position." "Sleeping," Silas said. "In a locked room." Crow absorbed that. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not panic, more like a recalculation. He was running the new variables. Silas watched it happen and used the 2 seconds of recalculation to shift his weight and angle. "You're one man," Crow said. "I have 4. "You had 5. Silas kept his voice the same as Crow's. Level, patient, the tone of a man discussing something practical. "The one you sent ahead to watch isn't available. That leaves you 4 on open ground against a man who knows this property considerably better than any of your people do, who has a deputy behind that water trough who will very much enjoy telling Sheriff Boone exactly what he saw tonight." He paused. "And a witness who has already put her identification of you in writing, in detail, which Boone has. So even if you solve the immediate problem, you haven't solved the problem." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes either a decision or a mistake, and Silas could not tell which one was coming. Crow said, "You're bluffing about the writing." "She described the ring on your right hand," Silas said. "Silver band, wide. You wore it the day you stood on the road and told your men to finish anyone still breathing. She was in the water by then. You never saw her go in." Something happened in Crow's face then. It was small, a tension around the jaw, a fractional narrowing. But Silas saw it, and what it told him was that the detail was accurate and that Crow had not known there was a witness who'd seen that specific moment. And then, from the south, one of the approaching men called out, "Mr. Crow? We're at the fence." Crow made his decision. He didn't fire at Silas. He angled the gun and fired into the air. One shot, loud and flat and carrying, which was a signal, and Silas knew what the signal meant before the echo finished. He was already moving when the second shot came, this one from the south fence, high and left, punching through the cabin wall somewhere above the kitchen window. He hit the ground behind the stone water basin on the west side, and the third shot took a chunk off the top of it. 3 positions, south fence, 2 men. Crow moving north, using Silas's own movement to create distance. The one at the east gate would be coming back at the sound of gunfire. And Silas was on the west side alone with the stone basin and the moonlight, and about 4 seconds before someone repositioned to a better angle. He heard Curtis return fire from behind the trough. 2 shots, controlled, not panicked. "Good." One of the south fence men answered and then went quiet, and Silas couldn't tell if Curtis had hit him or if he'd taken cover. He moved. He went back along the west wall to the north corner and around, keeping the cabin at his back, and came up to the north side window from outside, and went through it head first the way he'd come out, getting inside before the man repositioning from the south could clear the corner and find the angle. Inside the cabin, rifle in hand, he went to the front window and looked out. Crow was at the north fence line, 40 yards out, moving east, going for the dry creek bed. He was bleeding from somewhere. His left arm, it looked like, though the light was bad, which meant either Curtis had clipped him on one of those first two shots or Silas had grazed him when he went to ground. Either way, Crow was hurt and moving and making the calculation that the plan had failed for the evening. One of the south fence men was down. Silas could see the shape of him against the fence line. The second one had gone back into the tree line and wasn't visible. The man from the east gate was coming around the southeast corner of the barn. He'd heard the gunfire and come back, and he was coming too fast and not looking in the right direction. And Silas had a clear shot through the front window for about 2 seconds. He didn't take it. The man pulled up short when he found the south fence man down. He looked at the cabin, looked at the tree line, and made the same calculation Crow had made. The situation had not unfolded as expected, and the risk of continuing to press it had changed significantly. He picked up the downed man, still alive, Silas could tell from the way the weight moved, and started dragging him back toward the tree line. Silas let them go. He tracked Crow until he lost him in the dry creek bed to the north, and then he sat on the kitchen floor with his back against the wall and his rifle across his knees and waited for his heartbeat to do something less extreme. After a while, he heard Curtis's boots on the porch. "You all right in there?" Curtis called. "Yes, you?" "I'm fine. I think I hit one of them." "You did." He made it out. Silas stood up. His hands were steady again, which was the thing he always checked because his hands had never given away anything in a bad moment, and he was grateful for it. Crow went north into the creek bed. He's gone for now. Curtis came inside. He had a cut above his eye from something, flying wood probably, from a hit on the trough, that was bleeding freely enough to look dramatic but probably wasn't serious. He looked at the cabin walls and at the hole above the kitchen window and at Silas. "He's going to come back," Curtis said. "Yes," Silas said, "with more men and a different plan." He looked at the braided rug on the floor. "But not tonight. Tonight cost him something." He crossed to the rug and pulled it back and knocked on the hatch. 3 knocks, then 2, then 1, the sequence they'd established before she went down. A pause. Then the bracket scraped back and the hatch opened from below, and Vivian came up out of the cellar with dust on her dress, and her face pale, and her eyes moving immediately and with precision across the room, cataloging the bullet hole, the state of the furniture, Curtis's bleeding forehead, Silas. Last. Checked him the way someone checks a thing they are trying to be calm about. "Are you hurt?" "No?" She accepted that. Looked at Curtis. "Sit down. Let me see that." "It's fine," Curtis said. "Sit down," she repeated in the tone that was not a suggestion, and Curtis sat. She cleaned the cut with water and the cloth she'd had with her in the cellar. She'd brought supplies, Silas noticed, which meant she'd thought through what she might need before she went down there, which was exactly the kind of thinking that was beginning to feel less surprising and more simply characteristic. And Curtis submitted to it with the muted stoicism of a young man trying not to appear affected by being tended to. When she was done, she stood and looked at Silas. "He got away," she said. "He got away. And he's going to come back with a plan that doesn't require him to stand in a yard and argue with you." "Yes." She pressed her lips together, looked at the window. Outside, the night was quiet again, though not the same kind of quiet as before. It was the quiet after something has happened, which has a different texture than the quiet before. "We need Boone here before morning," she said. "Curtis is going to ride now." Silas looked at the deputy, who nodded, already standing. "Tell him everything," Vivian said to Curtis. "Crow's wounded. He'll need medical attention. That's a place to look for him if you have anyone to spare." She said it without looking up from where she was repacking the cloth in the water basin. "A wound like that, arm or shoulder, from the angle you described. He's not going to ride to a town where he's known. He'll have someone come to him, which means you're looking for movement toward his property, not away from it." Curtis looked at her for a moment, then at Silas. "She's right," Silas said. Curtis left. Boone arrived before 4 in the morning with 2 deputies and a face like a man who'd been riding hard and thinking harder. He came in through the east gate the way Silas had told him to and left one deputy on the perimeter immediately, which was the right call and meant he'd been thinking tactically on the ride out rather than just urgently. He stood in the kitchen and listened to Silas's account without interrupting. Then he listened to Vivian's additions. She had been listening through the cellar ceiling for portions of it and filled in what she'd heard of the exchange between Silas and Crow. And his expression through all of it was the steady, effortful calm of a man managing something bigger than his county. When they finished, he said, "The marshal wire came back this morning. 2 men, riding from Cheyenne, expected to arrive tomorrow evening if they push hard." "Tomorrow evening," Silas said. "I know. Crow's going to move before then." "I know that too." Boone took off his hat and rubbed his forehead. "I've sent word to the circuit judge in Dalton's Creek. Based on the written testimony and the deputy's witness account from tonight, I can push for an emergency warrant by tomorrow morning. Getting Crow arrested on his own property before he can regroup is the cleanest solution." "If he's still on his property," Vivian said. "If he's still on his property," Boone agreed. He looked at her with the expression he'd started wearing around her. The one that wasn't quite apology, but acknowledged that his earlier assessments had been incomplete. "You did well tonight, staying down." "I stayed down because Silas asked me to," she said, "and because I understood why." A pause. "That's not the same as it being the right permanent strategy." Boone looked at her. "What's the right permanent strategy?" "Get me in front of a judge," she said. "Whatever happens on that property tonight or tomorrow, get me in front of a judge and on the record before Crow can disappear. Because wounded and outwitted, he's going to cut his losses if he can. Disappear into territory, change his name, start the whole thing over somewhere else." Her voice was steady, but it had an edge to it that Silas had not heard before. Not anger, something older and more patient than anger. He didn't just rob that stagecoach. He killed 8 people because they were inconvenient. And I'm not going to be the last inconvenient person he decides to eliminate unless there's a legal record that makes eliminating me pointless. The kitchen was quiet. Boone put his hat back on. "I'll have you before a judge by tomorrow noon," he said. "You have my word on that." "Good," she said. "Then we just need to get to tomorrow noon." It was Curtis who brought the news at first light, riding back from town with the dust of the road still on him and the look of a man who has been up all night and found something at the end of it. He'd found where Crow had gone. Not his own property. Vivian had been right about that. Crow had gone to a smaller house 6 miles north, the property of a man named Hale, who the deputies suspected was connected to the gang but hadn't been able to prove. A local doctor had been seen riding that direction at midnight. One of Boone's deputies had picked up the trail and confirmed it. 3 horses at the Hale property, one of them Crow's bay gelding. Boone sent his 2 deputies immediately with the warrant application, which the circuit judge, reached by a deputy at his home, had signed at 11 at night on the strength of Curtis's eyewitness account and the written identification. Silas read the warrant when Curtis brought it back, and the specific language of it: Garrett Crow, accused of murder in the 1st degree, robbery, and conspiracy, was the plainest, most functional thing he'd read in a long time. He showed it to Vivian. She read it twice, then set it down on the table and said nothing for a moment. "That's his name," she said finally. "Printed on a federal document." "It is." "It's going to stand." He didn't say yes immediately because he'd learned that she wasn't asking for comfort. She was asking for honest assessment. So he thought about it honestly and then said, "Boone is a careful man. He wouldn't have pushed for the warrant if he thought it wouldn't hold. And you've got a deputy's eyewitness account of last night on top of your written testimony. That's 2 sources." She nodded slowly. "And if he runs before they get there? Then they follow. And if he gets to territory without extradition? Then the federal marshals follow that." Silas looked at her. "He's not invisible anymore. He was invisible for 3 years because nobody knew what to look at. That's over." She looked at the warrant on the table for a moment longer. Then she reached out and turned it face down, which was the deliberate gesture of someone putting something away in order to think about something else. "What time does Boone need me at the courthouse?" 10 o'clock. "Then I need 2 hours of sleep." She looked at him. "Are you going to sleep?" "After you do." She studied him briefly. "You should sleep first. You did more than I did last night." "I disagree." "You disagreed incorrectly," she said, which was close enough to a joke that it almost sounded like one. She turned toward the back room and then stopped in the doorway without fully turning back. Silas? Yeah. A pause. He got the sense she was sorting through options and rejecting most of them. When this is finished, she said finally. The trial, the marshals, all of it. I haven't decided where I'm going yet, whether I still go to Ridgecrest or… She didn't finish that thought. Let it remain partial. I haven't decided. He didn't fill the silence with anything. He'd learned she didn't need that. Okay, he said. She nodded once and went through the door. At 10 o'clock, she sat in front of the circuit judge in Dalton's Creek Courthouse, and for 2 hours she gave her testimony with the same organized, unsparing precision she'd brought to every account since the first night in Martha's house. The judge was a sparse, attentive man named Holloway, who had heard a great deal of testimony in his career and had the quality of someone who could tell the difference between a rehearsed account and a true one. He listened, he asked questions, he wrote. Silas waited outside the courthouse door. He was not a man comfortable with waiting, which he'd established early in life and had never successfully revised. He stood, and he walked, and he sat, and he stood again, and he thought about the ranch and whether the deputies had reached the Hale property yet, and he thought about Boone, who had ridden there himself, and he thought about the east fence and the second post he hadn't gotten to yet, and whether the concrete had fully cured. He thought about what Vivian had said in the doorway. I haven't decided. It was not an invitation, and he was not going to treat it as one. But it was also not a statement of departure, and he was, carefully, honestly, without letting it become something he leaned on, noting that there was a difference. When she came out, she looked wrung out and clear-eyed in equal measure. She came to stand beside him at the top of the courthouse steps and looked at the street below. The ordinary mid-morning movement of a small frontier town, horses and wagons, and people who had no idea what had happened 12 miles out on a dark ranch the night before. It's done, she said. How'd you feel about it? She thought about that. Like I said, everything and nothing was left out. A pause. That's the best I could do. That's enough, he said. She looked at the street a moment longer. Then something shifted in her posture. Not collapse, more like a very slow release of pressure that had been held too long. She put her hand on the post at the top of the steps, just steadying herself, and when he moved slightly closer, she didn't move away. They stood like that for a little while, not touching, just occupying the same piece of mourning, which had its own kind of weight. Then Curtis came around the corner at a half-run, breathing hard, and looked up at both of them with an expression that was doing its best to stay professional and not quite managing it. Boone's men reached the Hale property, he said. Silas straightened. Crow? Curtis's chest was still heaving slightly from the run. He looked at Vivian, then at Silas. They got him. He tried to ride when he saw the deputies coming, but the arm… Curtis shook his head. He couldn't hold the reins right. They had him before he reached the tree line. The silence on the steps lasted about 3 seconds. Vivian exhaled. One slow breath, deliberate, like setting down something she'd been carrying at an awkward angle for too long. She didn't cry. She didn't speak immediately. She just stood there and breathed and let it be what it was. Hale, she said. In custody, and they found 2 more men at the property, riders from the gang, both arrested. She nodded, turned to Silas. Her face was difficult to read in the specific way that faces become difficult when there are too many things in them to settle on any single one. It's not over, she said. The trial, I know. And the others, the ones who weren't at the Hale place. Boone will work it. I know he will. She looked at him directly, that steady look that he'd stopped finding startling and had started finding something else, something he hadn't exactly named. I'm going to have to testify again, formally, at the trial. Yes. That could take months to arrange. Probably, he said. She held his gaze. A breath passed. 2. She looked like a woman standing at the edge of a decision she'd already made but hadn't said out loud yet, and the act of saying it was the last step. I'm going to need somewhere to stay, she said, while the legal proceedings are arranged. Somewhere I know, somewhere that's… She didn't say safe. He got the sense she'd chosen a different word deliberately. Somewhere that's settled. Silas looked at her. At the courthouse steps below them, and the street, and the ordinary mid-morning town, and the long road west that eventually, 12 miles out, reached a piece of Wyoming land with a repaired hinge and a reorganized supply cabinet and 2 fence posts newly set in concrete. "I know a place," he said. She almost smiled. It was close enough to count, but behind that almost smile, and behind the slow exhale of relief, and beneath the courthouse steps where Garrett Crow's arrest warrant was already being processed, behind all of that, something was still moving that neither of them had fully reckoned with yet. Because Crow had been caught with 3 men, and Boone's own count from 2 prior robberies had put the gang at 8 riders, which meant there were still 4 men somewhere in the territory who knew exactly what a surviving witness was worth, and who had not yet received any instruction to stop. And one of them, at that precise moment, was reading a telegram in a saloon 40 miles east that said the operation at the Granger Ranch had failed. He read it twice, folded it carefully, put it in his breast pocket, and ordered another drink while he thought about what to do next. The man in the saloon's name was Del Rourke, and he was the kind of patient that made him dangerous. Most men in his line of work were dangerous because they were fast, or because they were reckless, or because they didn't think about consequences until after the fact. Rourke was dangerous because he thought about consequences first, planned around them methodically, and was willing to wait as long as the situation required. He'd been with Crow's operation for 2 years. He'd ridden on 4 jobs and left no traceable evidence on any of them, which was a record he intended to maintain. He sat in the saloon in Eldon Crossing for 40 minutes after reading the telegram, drinking 1 whiskey slowly, and ran the situation through his mind the way a man runs figures, not emotionally, just accurately. Crow was arrested. Hale was arrested. 3 riders taken. That left Rourke and 3 others from the original 8, all of them scattered across different parts of the territory by design, the way Crow had always structured things so that no single arrest could unravel the whole. The design had worked, up to a point. The point being a 25-year-old school teacher who'd gone into a river and come out the other side alive. The witness was the problem. She always had been. Crow had understood it immediately. That's why he'd moved on the ranch. The failure there had cost him everything, and now the question was whether the remaining men cut their losses entirely or whether eliminating the witness still served a purpose. Rourke thought about that carefully. With Crow in custody, a trial was coming. A trial required testimony. Testimony from the witness who had identified Crow directly and in writing, which Rourke understood from the telegram to be already in legal hands. Crow's conviction was probably inevitable at this point. Rourke was realistic about that. But the witness's testimony at a formal trial would also pull threads. Names, descriptions, patterns. A thorough prosecutor asking a thorough witness what she'd seen and heard would surface things that connected to people beyond Crow, including Rourke, including the other 3. So it wasn't about saving Crow. That was already done. It was about the testimony itself. He finished the whiskey, left a coin on the bar, walked out into the morning and stood in the street with the sun on his face and thought about 40 miles and what could be accomplished in the window between a man being arrested and a trial being organized. These things took time. Lawyers, judges, scheduling. The witness would be under protection, but protection required resources, and a small county sheriff's office in Frontier, Wyoming, had finite resources and a new and complicated situation on its hands. He thought about timing. He thought about approach. He thought about the 4 men currently unaccounted for in the territory, and which of them he trusted to be useful rather than a liability in a situation that required subtlety. He settled on 2 names, sent wires to both before noon, then he bought a horse he hadn't used before and started riding west. Boone got the news about Rourke on the 2nd day after Crow's arrest, and it came from the worst possible source, the marshal's office in Cheyenne, which had been tracking Rourke as a person of interest for 8 months, and had just discovered, through the same informant who'd named Crow, that Rourke was the organizational mind behind the gang's logistics. Not the man who gave orders in the field, that had been Crow, but the man who arranged timing, identified targets, and managed the money that moved through 3 different banks in 2 territories under names that weren't his. The 2 federal marshals who arrived that evening, Calhoun and Price, both career men in their 40s, with the weathered, economical manner of people who had been dealing with worse situations than this for a long time, sat in Boone's office and laid out what they knew. Rourke was more careful than Crow. He had no property in his own name, no fixed address, and a talent for moving through territory without leaving the kind of trace that could be followed in a straight line. He'd made contact with at least 2 other gang members in the 48 hours since Crow's arrest. His last confirmed location was Eldon Crossing, 40 miles east, but that was 18 hours old by the time the wire arrived. "He's already closer than that," Marshal Calhoun said. He was the taller of the two, with a gray mustache and the habit of stating things plainly rather than softening them. "He'll have moved immediately after making contact. A man like this doesn't stay where you last saw him." "What does he want?" Boone said, though he already knew. "Same thing Crow wanted. The testimony stopped before trial." Calhoun looked at his notes. "But Rourke is smarter about how he goes after things. He's not going to ride up to a ranch in the dark with 4 men. He's going to find a subtler problem to create." "Meaning?" Silas said. He was sitting in the corner of Boone's office because he'd been there when the marshals arrived and Boone hadn't sent him out, which Silas had taken as implied permission to stay. Calhoun looked at him. "Meaning he might try to intercept the witness during transit. He might try to create a situation where protection is divided, a distraction elsewhere that pulls resources away. He might approach through someone trusted who he's compromised." He paused. "Or he might find a way to introduce doubt about the witness's credibility before she testifies. People with money and patience have options that people running out of time don't." "She's not going to be discredited," Silas said. "I didn't say she would be. I said he'd try." Calhoun looked at him steadily. "Where is she now?" "My ranch." "That's where he failed last time," Price said. He was shorter, quieter, with small, sharp eyes that moved around a room the way a man's eyes move when he's memorizing it. "He'll know the layout now. He won't try the same approach." "No," Silas said. "He won't." He rode back to the ranch that evening with Marshal Price riding alongside him and the specific feeling of a man who has been managing a situation that has just gotten larger than his management of it. Price had said little on the ride, but had asked 3 practical questions about the property's layout, water sources, and the secondary road, and Silas had answered all 3 accurately because accurate was what the situation required. Vivian was at the kitchen table when they came in. She'd cooked. There was a pot on the stove that smelled like something with onions and preserved meat, and she had the pages of her written testimony in front of her, reading them again with the expression of someone reviewing something for errors. She looked up when the door opened, registered Price's badge and the expression on Silas's face, and said, "What happened?" It wasn't a question. Silas told her about Rourke, while Price moved through the cabin doing the quiet assessment he'd been doing since he arrived, checking sight lines from windows and the security of the hatch and the ventilation gap. Vivian listened to the full account without interrupting. When Silas finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He's smarter than Crow," she said, "by some accounts. So a direct assault is less likely." She looked at the testimony pages. "Which means he comes at it sideways, a problem that looks like something else." She straightened the pages carefully. "Have the marshals been compromised before? By people like him?" Price had come back to the doorway. "It's happened," he said. "Not to us, but it's happened." She looked at Price. "And the judge? Holloway?" "He's been informed. He has his own security concerns. He's not a man who frightens easily." "Good." She looked at the testimony again. "How soon can the trial begin?" 3 weeks minimum," Price said. "There are procedural requirements, and the defense will request delays." 3 weeks, she said quietly. "We'll have you in protective custody before then. You and the testimony both." She looked at Silas. Something passed between them in that look. Not a conversation exactly, more an acknowledgement of where things stood. He was standing in his own kitchen, feeling the specific unfamiliarity of having too many people in it and not enough room to think. "I'll stay here until they're ready to move me," she said. Not to Price specifically, to both of them. "That's the recommendation," Price said. "Keep her where Rourke's already failed once, reinforce the position, and move her under full marshal escort when we have the logistics secured." "How many men do you have?" Silas said. "Counting Boone's deputies, 7. I've sent for 2 more from Cheyenne. They'll arrive by end of week." 7, then 9. Against Rourke, and 2 confirmed contacts and possibly a 3rd. Better odds than the night Crow had come, though Silas was aware that better odds and Rourke's planning ability were 2 separate variables that didn't automatically cancel each other. He cooked dinner because it was his kitchen, and it was something practical to do, and they ate, the 3 of them plus Curtis, who was still assigned to the ranch. and it was the strangest dinner Silas had experienced in 6 years of eating alone, which was strange only in the specific way that things are strange when they've become necessary before you fully intended them to be. The first 3 days of the new watch were quiet, and Silas distrusted the quiet more than he distrusted the obvious threat. Rourke's absence wasn't neutrality, it was patience. The man was somewhere in the territory choosing his angle, and the fact that nothing was happening only meant the angle hadn't been completed yet. On the fourth day, the problem came from a direction nobody had watched carefully enough. It came through Martha. She arrived at the ranch mid-morning, which was not unusual. She'd been checking on Vivian every few days since the beginning, and her coming and going had become routine enough that the deputy on the road waved her through without a second thought. She came through the front door with her medical bag and a jar of preserved plums and the expression she habitually wore, which was competent and direct and gave nothing away unnecessarily. She came straight to the kitchen, set the plums on the counter, and said, "There's a man in town asking questions about the Granger property." Everyone in the kitchen stopped moving. "I noticed him yesterday," Martha continued, in the same level voice she used for everything from delivering babies to delivering bad news. "Didn't think much of it. Visitors passed through. But he was asking specific questions about the access roads, whether the creek on the north side ran year-round." She set her bag on the table. "And he paid for the information with a coin I haven't seen before. Silver, but the stamp on it wasn't from any U.S. mint I recognize." Price was already at the door. Description: medium height, lean, dark coat, brown hat with a flat brim. "I was at the general store and then the saloon, and he ate at the boarding house dinner table last night and talked to 3 different people before anyone thought to mention it to me." She looked at Silas. "He asked the boarding house owner whether a school teacher had come through the area recently. Said he was trying to locate a relative." Vivian, who had been standing in the doorway to the back room, said, "That's not Rourke." Price turned to look at her. "Rourke's careful," she said. "You said so yourself. He doesn't go to 3 places in one town and ask 3 separate people. That's not subtle, that's sloppy." She moved into the kitchen. "That's bait." The word landed, and everyone in the room ran the implication at the same time. A man drawing attention in town, being visible, being noticed, being described, while something else happened somewhere else. "The testimony," Silas said. He said it, and Price was already moving, going for his horse, calling to the deputy outside in a voice that had switched registers entirely. No longer the quiet assessment voice, the urgent one. Curtis came in from the barn at a run. "Where's the testimony kept?" Price called back from the door. "Boone's office," Silas said. "The original. Vivian kept a copy here." Price was already outside. They heard his horse move at a hard gallop within 30 seconds of him clearing the door. Martha stood in the kitchen looking at nobody in particular, processing whether she'd done the right thing coming directly here instead of going to Boone's office first. Silas read that expression on her and said, "You did right, Martha." "I should have come yesterday when I first saw him." "Yes," Vivian said, from the table where she'd sat down and was looking at the copy of her testimony in front of her. "But you came today, which is still before it's too late." A pause. "Is it still before it's too late?" Nobody answered, because nobody knew. It was, and it wasn't. Price reached Boone's office to find the building intact and Boone at his desk, which was the good news. The complication was that Boone's second deputy, a man named Ferris, who'd been with him 4 years and never given reason for doubt, had taken a copy of the testimony filing to the courthouse records office that morning for standard procedural processing, and Ferris had not returned. His horse was at the hitching post outside the records office. The records office clerk had seen him come in and seen him go into the back room to file, and had not seen him come out because she'd had customers. Ferris was found 40 minutes later in the back room, tied to the shelving with his own belt, alive and uninjured except for the knock on his head that had taken him out before he understood what was happening. The man who'd hit him had taken the filed copy and been through the back window and gone. The testimony copy was gone. Silas heard this from Curtis, who heard it from a writer Boone sent from town, and he sat with it for a moment at the kitchen table before he said anything. "It doesn't change what she can say in court," he said, finally, to nobody in particular. "No," Vivian said, "but it changes what they have to work with. If they can argue there's no documented record, there's Holloway," Martha said. He heard the testimony directly. "Holloway's one judge. Defense attorneys make cases out of less than a missing document. Vivian's voice was steady, but her hands on the table were not. She pressed them flat. They're not trying to stop the trial. They're trying to create enough doubt that the conviction doesn't stick. She looked at Silas. It was never about silencing me permanently. It's about making my testimony look unreliable. A missing copy suggests tampering. By whom? That's the question a defense attorney plants in a jury's mind. Silas looked at her hands flat on the table. Can you rewrite it? He said. Exactly as it was. She looked at him. Every detail you put in the first one, he said. Word for word if you can manage it. Dated today, witnessed today, a second original. It won't be the same document. No, but it'll be the same information, witnessed by a federal marshal and a sheriff and a circuit judge if Boone can get Holloway to ride out here. He held her gaze. That's 3 legal witnesses to a second original. It doesn't solve the problem, but it narrows it. She thought about that. He watched her running it through, finding the holes, measuring what it solved against what it didn't. It would have to be today, she said, before Rourke knows we've thought of it. Then start now. She started. She wrote for 3 hours, and Silas sent Curtis to town with a specific request for Boone and Holloway and Price, and Martha stayed and made coffee and occupied the room without making it smaller, which was a specific skill she had that Silas had never examined but always appreciated. Holloway arrived at 2 in the afternoon with the dusty hat and the sparse expression of a man who had been interrupted but understood why. He read the new document when Vivian finished it, compared it to his own notes from the courthouse session, and said, in his brief, conclusive way, "This is consistent with the testimony I received directly. I'll sign it." He signed it. Boone signed it. Price, back from town, signed it. Martha signed it as a witness to the proceeding. Silas signed it last because Holloway said they needed one more name and Silas was standing there. Vivian looked at his signature on the page. Something in her expression shifted quietly. Not dramatically, not the kind of shift that gets narrated, just the small recalibration of a person who has added something to a mental accounting. "Thank you," she said. "You wrote it," he said. I just held a pen." She looked at him. "You know that's not what I mean." He did know. He just wasn't comfortable receiving it directly, which was a limitation he was aware of and hadn't figured out how to fix. "I know," he said, and left it there. The 2 additional marshals arrived from Cheyenne the following morning, and with 9 armed men on and around the property, the ranch had taken on the quality of something fortified, which it now effectively was. The quiet man who'd asked questions in town had disappeared, which Price said was expected. Bait didn't have to stay in the water once the hook was set, and Rourke would know by now that the distraction had succeeded in one sense and failed in another. Price briefed everyone at the kitchen table that evening. The copy was gone, but the second original was signed and in Holloway's personal possession and would be with the court record before morning. Ferris was recovering. The man from town had left no trace that anyone could follow. Rourke was still somewhere, and they still didn't know exactly where, which was the constant frustration. "We move her the day after tomorrow," Price said. "Early, before light, full escort. The route goes north first, then cuts west to Dalton's Creek, rather than the direct road because the direct road has 3 places where the terrain favors an ambush, and I'd rather add 2 hours to the ride than present a gift to someone waiting for us." "She'll be safe in Dalton's Creek," Silas said. "We'll have a secure location arranged by tomorrow." "Yes." Price looked at him steadily. "Mr. Granger, once we move her, your involvement in this ends. You've done more than anyone could have asked. But from the transit forward, this is a federal proceeding, and the security is our responsibility." Silas nodded. He understood. He even agreed with the reasoning. None of that made it easier to hear. After Price left the kitchen, Vivian came to sit across from Silas at the table. She had 2 cups of coffee, and she set one in front of him and kept one for herself, and for a while neither of them said anything, which had become a comfortable mode between them that neither of them had declared comfortable. It had simply become that way over weeks of proximity. "Day after tomorrow," she said. "Yes." She turned the cup in her hands. "I keep thinking about the woman in the green coat." She said it quietly, without preamble, the way things surface when you stop actively keeping them down. "Eleanor." Her name was Eleanor. She told me at the rest stop in Dalton's Creek. She had a son waiting for her in Ridgecrest. The little boy behind the driver was someone else's child, but she'd been minding him the whole trip because his mother was sick. She stopped, started again. She didn't do anything. She was just there. And he killed her because she was there and there was no value in not killing her. Silas didn't say anything. She wasn't asking him to. "I've been angry," she said. "You know that. You've seen it. But underneath that," she paused, "underneath it is something that doesn't have a clean name. It's heavier than anger. It's more like—" She shook her head. "I can't explain it without making it sound like more than it is." "Survivor guilt," he said. Not elaborated. Just the name. She looked at him. "You know it." "Yes." "The war," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, receiving that, letting it mean what it meant, which was that he understood the specific texture of it, not theoretically, from having been somewhere it didn't belong, but other people did. "Does it change?" she said. He thought about it honestly. Not smaller, but different. He tried to find the right word. It gets further away from the center of things. You start being able to put other things at the center. She looked at her coffee, nodded slowly. "I'm going to do right by Eleanor," she said. "In that courtroom. Whatever they throw at the testimony, whatever the defense argues, I'm going to make sure it sticks." She looked up. "That's what I can do. That's the thing I have that she doesn't." "Yes," he said. They sat for a while longer. Outside the window, the night was clear and cold, and the stars were doing the thing they did this far from town. Enormous and indifferent and, despite themselves, beautiful. He didn't look at them particularly. He mostly looked at the table. But he was aware of them, the way you're aware of things that were there before you and will be there after. "Silas," she said. He looked up. She had the expression she got when she'd made a decision and was stating it rather than exploring it. "When the trial is done, when all of it is finished and I'm not someone's witness anymore and you're not someone's hiding place anymore." She stopped, tried again. "I don't want to go to Ridgecrest." He didn't move. "I've been thinking about it since the porch," she said. "What I said about not deciding. That was true then. It's not true now." She looked at him steadily. "I've decided." The kitchen was very quiet. "You should probably know," he said carefully, "that the east fence is mostly done, but the north side needs work before winter. And the barn roof has a section over the east stall that I haven't gotten to, and the supply cabinet. I reorganized the supply cabinet," she said. "I know. I know you know." They looked at each other. He had never been particularly articulate about the things that mattered most to him, and he was not going to become articulate about them tonight, and she seemed to understand that and not require it, which was, of all the things about her that he'd cataloged in the past weeks, the one he found most remarkable. "All right," he said. She almost smiled, fully this time. It didn't get to finish because Price knocked on the door and came in with news about Rourke's probable location, a farmstead 12 miles southeast, confirmed by one of the new Cheyenne marshals who'd recognized a horse. And the table shifted back into operational. Plans were revised, the transit route reconsidered, the timing moved up by 12 hours to account for the new information. But Silas moved through the rest of that evening with the particular careful attention of a man who has put something in a pocket and intends to find it again later, and is watching to make sure it stays where he put it. The trouble came at 4 in the morning, 2 hours before the planned transit. Not Rourke himself. The marshals at the southeast farmstead had boxed him in by midnight and taken him after a standoff that Silas heard about secondhand, which had involved a barn fire that Rourke had started himself as a distraction and which had worked well enough to allow one of his 2 men to escape into the dark. The other was taken. Rourke was taken. But the one who'd escaped had come northwest. And at 4 in the morning, he was at the Granger property with a burning rag and a clear shot at the barn. The fire caught the east wall of the barn before the deputy on the south perimeter saw the orange and raised the alarm. And by the time Silas was out of the structure, the fire had the dry summer wood of the east wall committed and was moving fast. He got the horses out, both of them, and the mule who went sideways and tried to kick him, and he grabbed its halter and physically dragged it into the pasture, because losing the mule to a fire was a minor indignity he was not going to accept. The man who'd set it was gone by then, running for the dry creek bed, and 2 of the marshals went after him and caught him before he reached the north fence line. Silas heard the shouting and the single warning shot and then nothing, and concluded the problem was managed. The barn burned. He stood in the yard and watched it, and he'd be lying if he said there wasn't something in him that felt it in a specific way. 6 years of his own building and maintaining and improving, and dry Wyoming summer turning it into orange light against a black sky. It was not the same as losing people. He kept that clear in his mind. But it was not nothing either. Price appeared beside him.
The animals are out? All of them. The cabin's not in danger. Wind's running south. I know. Price stood with him for a moment, watching the fire do its final work on the walls. The transit proceeds in 2 hours regardless, he said. The situation with Rourke is contained. His man is in custody. The gang is... He did a count in his head. Accounted for. All 8. Good, Silas said. You understand the barn can be rebuilt. I'm aware of that. Price nodded once and went to manage the logistics of the transit. Silas stood by himself in the yard for another few minutes, watching the structure he'd built in his second year on this land settle into itself and go to ash. He was not a man who narrated his own emotions to himself. He found it unhelpful and vaguely dishonest. But he was aware of several things at once: the specific loss of the barn, the specific relief that the loss was only the barn, the specific and separate awareness that in 2 hours Vivian would be put on a horse with 7 armed men and would begin the journey toward a courtroom and a trial and a future that was hers and no longer his to have any part in. He stood there with all of it and let it be what it was. Then the cabin door opened, and she was standing on the porch in the firelight, looking at him and at the barn and at the orange sky with the expression of someone who is trying to find the right thing to do with their hands and hasn't decided yet. He walked back to the porch. She looked at the barn. I'm sorry, she said. It's wood, he said. Wood comes back. She looked at him then, and the firelight was in her eyes, and she said, So will I. He held, turned it over, put it in the same pocket as the other thing, where it could keep. I know, he said, and he meant it the same way she did, which was completely, without qualification, and without needing to say so twice. They rode out before the barn had finished cooling. Price had the transit organized the way a man organizes something when he's done it before and knows what the variables are. Vivian on the steadiest horse, flanked on both sides, 2 marshals riding .50 yards ahead and 2 more trailing, Curtis on the east flank, because he knew the terrain and Price had stopped pretending local knowledge wasn't worth something. The route went north first, then cut west along the high ground where the sight lines were long, and there was nothing to hide behind for a quarter mile in every direction. Silas stood at the east pasture gate and watched them go. He'd walked her to the horse. He'd checked the saddle once, which was habit, not doubt, and she'd let him do it without comment, which was its own kind of communication. She'd had a small bag, not much, the things Martha had brought, and a few items from the cabin, and she'd put it over the saddle herself. Before Price gave the word to move, she'd looked down at Silas from the horse with the morning light coming up behind her and said, When you rebuild the barn, leave the east stall bigger than before. The mule needs room. The mule needs discipline, he said. The mule needs room, she repeated firmly. He's not mean. He's just crowded. He'd almost said something else. He was aware of several things he could have said. Instead, he'd put his hand briefly on the horse's neck, close to her boot, and said, Ride safe. She'd held his gaze for one beat. All right. Price called the move and she went, and Silas stood at the gate until they were over the ridge and gone from sight. And then he stood there a while longer because the horizon didn't have anything better to offer, and the ranch behind him had a burned-out barn and a very quiet cabin and approximately no task urgent enough to demand his immediate attention. He went and started clearing the ash. It was not a clean or comfortable period of time. He'd spent 6 years alone on that ranch without particular difficulty, and now the specific quality of the aloneness had changed in a way that made it noticeable in a way it hadn't been before. Not unbearable. He was not a man given to making his own misery larger than it was, but noticeable. The supply cabinet organized the way someone else had organized it. The second chair on the porch. The novel with the red cover she'd read twice, still on the shelf because she hadn't taken it and he hadn't moved it. He rebuilt the barn. He did it methodically and without hurrying because hurrying produced inferior work and the barn needed to last. He went to the lumberyard in town twice, the second time finding himself in a conversation with the yard owner's wife, who asked about the fire and whether he'd had trouble with the drought conditions out his way. And he answered both questions and noted that she said the fire rather than asking about it, which meant the story had traveled.
which meant the town knew something about what had happened on his property in the past weeks. Not the details, probably, but enough. Martha came out on the 5th day. She sat on the porch with him in the evening and didn't mention Vivian directly, which Silas appreciated, and she talked instead about the weather and about a new family coming into the area looking to homestead. And eventually she said, "You look like a man waiting for something." "I am," he said. "Well," Martha said, "at least you know what you're waiting for. Some people wait their whole lives without even that." He thought about that after she left. He decided she was right, which was usually the conclusion he arrived at when he thought carefully about things Martha said. The first letter came 11 days after she left. It was brief because she had limited time and a lot happening. Those were her words. But it covered what it needed to cover. She was in Dalton's Creek under protection. The trial was being organized for the following month. The prosecutor was a man named Aldrich, who was thorough and serious and had already spent 4 hours with her going through the testimony line by line. Garrett Crow had secured a defense attorney from Cheyenne who was, in Vivian's measured assessment, expensive and talented, and who would do everything the law allowed to create doubt about what she'd seen. At the bottom of the letter, after the practical information, she'd written, "The mule came to mind today when the marshal's horse tried to bite me during the morning check. I told Price the horse needed room, not discipline. He didn't find it as funny as I expected." The barn. How is it coming? He wrote back that evening. He told her the barn was coming along and that the east stall was going to be larger because she'd been right about the mule. He told her that the north fence was finished and that the second post was holding properly. He told her that Martha had been by and was well. He told her at the bottom that the chair on the porch was still there. He wasn't sure she'd read it the way he meant it. He decided that was all right either way. The trial of Garrett Crow began on a Tuesday in the second week of October in the Dalton's Creek Courthouse, which was a larger building than Holloway's circuit setup and had a gallery that filled entirely on the first day and stayed full for the duration. Silas rode in for the first day and sat in the gallery. He sat in the back, which was where he preferred to be in any room where something important was happening, able to see everything, required to explain himself to nobody. He watched Crow come in. He'd not seen the man since the night in the yard with their guns on each other, and what he noticed now was that Crow had the same quality he'd always had, the arranged pleasantness, the economy of movement, but it was sitting differently on him in these circumstances, slightly too deliberate, the way a coat fits a man who's lost weight. The defense attorney was good. Silas had expected that and was not surprised. His name was Marsh, and he moved through the courtroom with the comfortable authority of a man who had made his career in rooms like this, and his opening statement was built carefully around 3 things: the chaos of the attack, the trauma experienced by the witness, and the fallibility of human memory under extreme conditions. He was not cruel about it. He was methodical. He planted the seeds of doubt with the precision of someone who understood that juries didn't need to be convinced of a lie. They only needed to be uncertain about the truth. The prosecutor Aldrich opened with the facts. Clean, sequential, evidenced. He was not flashy. He didn't need to be. Vivian testified on the 3rd day. Silas was in the gallery again. He watched her come through the side door and cross to the witness stand, and she walked the way she always walked, straight, deliberate, without the performance of composure, but composure nonetheless, the real kind that comes from having decided something rather than from suppressing something. She sat. She looked at Aldrich and then, briefly, at the gallery. She found him. Nodded once, slightly, turned back to the front. She testified for 4 hours across 2 sessions. Silas had heard the account many times by now. The attack, the sequence of events, the man with the scar across his left jaw giving orders in a voice that was almost bored. He'd heard it from her directly, heard it in her written words, heard it referenced in Boone's reports and Price's briefings. But hearing it in a courtroom, stated plainly and completely in her voice, with the formal weight of legal proceeding around it, was different. It had a different gravity. It became, in that room, the thing it had always been, the last words of Eleanor in the green coat, and the child behind the driver and 7 other people who were going about the ordinary business of traveling west, transmitted forward through the one person who'd survived long enough to carry them. Marsh cross-examined her for 2 hours. He was precise and professional, and he pushed on every edge he could find. The chaos of the moment, the injury to her head, the days of fever before she'd given her first formal account. He asked whether she could be certain of the scar's position given the speed of events. He asked whether the man she'd seen giving orders might have been someone other than his client. He asked these questions without aggression, in a tone of sincere inquiry, which was more effective than aggression would have been. She answered every question the same way, directly, specifically, without hedging the things she was certain of, and without claiming certainty she didn't have. When Marsh asked her to concede that trauma could distort memory, she said, "Some memories are affected by trauma. This one isn't. I had already looked directly at him for several seconds before I understood what was happening. By the time I understood, I'd already seen him clearly." Marsh asked whether she could say with absolute certainty. She said, "I can say with the certainty of someone who was there. I can't give you more than that, and I don't think you'd trust it if I tried." There was a sound in the gallery. Not applause, not quite. More like the small collective exhale of a room that has been holding its breath. Marsh moved on. The jury took 2 days. Silas stayed in Dalton's Creek through both of them. He was not comfortable in town, particularly not a man who enjoyed the social geometry of boarding house dinners and street conversations. But he was not going to be 40 miles away when the verdict came. He stayed at the smaller of the 2 boarding houses, which had fewer people in the dining room, and he ate and walked and stayed out of the saloon and waited. On the second evening, Vivian came to find him. Price had allowed it. She was still technically under protective supervision, but with all 8 gang members in custody and the trial in its final hours, the strict confinement had eased. She came to the boarding house porch where he was sitting with the almanac he'd brought because it was the thing in his saddlebag, and found him staring at a weather table with the focus of a man who is not actually reading a weather table. She sat in the chair next to him. She looked tired in the specific way of someone who has spent weeks being more precise than a person ought to have to be for extended periods, a kind of tiredness that wasn't about sleep. "Marsh was good," she said. "You were better." "I was honest," she said. "That's not always the same thing as better, but in this case I think it'll hold." She looked at the street. "Aldrich thinks the jury's with us." He said it carefully, the way lawyers say things they believe but can't guarantee. "Do you think so?" She was quiet for a moment. "I think Eleanor deserves to have it hold," she said. "I think the little boy deserves it. Whether the jury agrees—" She stopped. "That's the part you can't control. You do the work honestly, and then you let the result be what it is." He looked at her. She was looking at the street, but she wasn't seeing the street. She was seeing something further back or further forward. And her hands were in her lap with the fingers loosely laced, and there was a crescent-shaped mark on the back of her left wrist that he'd noticed before and never asked about. From the river, probably. The bark of the cottonwood. "After tomorrow," she said. "Whatever it is, I want to go back." He didn't ask where. "I've been offered the teaching position in Ridgecrest," she continued. "Formally. The letter came last week. And She paused. "I wrote back and told them I'd accepted a different posting." He was very still. "There's a school in Carver's Bend," she said. "I spoke to the town council representative who came through Dalton's Creek last month. They've been without a teacher for 2 years. The building exists, the position's funded, and—" She finally looked at him. "It's 12 miles from a certain ranch that I happen to know has a reorganized supply cabinet and a repaired window hinge and a barn that's apparently being rebuilt with a larger east stall." He looked at her for a long moment. "You didn't mention this," he said. "I'm mentioning it now." "You wrote letters." "I wrote letters about the trial. This is a different conversation." She held his gaze. "I didn't want to tell you until I knew, until I'd decided properly, not just because I was frightened or grateful or—" She searched for the word. "Not for the wrong reasons. I wanted to decide it when things were settled enough that I could trust my own judgment." He thought about that, about the specific honesty of it, the deliberateness of waiting to be certain before saying the certain thing. He recognized it. It was the same way he made decisions. He'd never encountered it that clearly in another person before. "The mule's going to be difficult," he said. She almost smiled. "I know. And the north fence needs a gate added at the creek crossing. That's work I haven't started." "I can help with a gate." "You've never built a fence gate." "I fixed your window hinge," she said. "I can learn a gate." He looked at the street. The evening was going its ordinary way, people finishing their day, the lamplight coming on in windows. A dog crossing the road with the purposeful air of a dog that has somewhere specific to be. The world continuing its business around two people on a porch deciding something. "All right," he said. She exhaled. Not with relief exactly. It was quieter than relief, more like the sound of something settling into its right position. "All right," she said. They sat on the porch until the evening was full dark, and they talked. About the school in Carver's Bend, about the ranch, about what winter looked like on the frontier for someone who'd spent every winter of her life in Ohio. He told her about the particular quality of a Wyoming January, and she listened with the expression of someone filing information rather than being discouraged by it, which he appreciated. She told him about her father's schoolroom, where she'd learned to teach by watching, and about the Ohio winters that had their own character, less open than this, more enclosed, the cold coming down through bare trees rather than across open grass. They were different histories that had arrived at the same porch, and neither of them pretended otherwise, and that was fine. That was more than fine, actually. It was the kind of thing that holds better than similarity in the long run. The verdict came the next morning at 10 o'clock. Guilty. On all counts. Silas heard it from the gallery and watched Crow receive it. The arranged pleasantness didn't collapse. The man was too practiced for that. But it changed quality. It became something else, something that had given up the performance but hadn't decided yet what to replace it with. He sat with his hands in front of him and said nothing and looked at the table. Vivian, in the witness row where Aldrich had asked her to sit for the reading, looked straight ahead. She did not visibly react in the gallery's sense. No tears, no expression of triumph, nothing that could be performed. But Silas, who had spent weeks learning to read what was happening underneath the surface of her, saw the small shift in her shoulders, the release of something that had been carried for a long time and had just been put down. For Eleanor, he thought. For the child. For the 7 names on Boone's report. Crow received 35 years without possibility of early release. Rourke, tried separately in a federal court in Cheyenne, his crimes crossing territory lines, received a life sentence 4 weeks later. The remaining 6 members of the gang received sentences ranging from 15 years to life, depending on their individual involvement. The last trial concluded in December. It was over. Vivian came back to the ranch on the first clear day of November, which arrived after a week of gray weather with the specific quality of a day that has decided to be cooperative. Price brought her himself, which she said was unnecessary, and he said was protocol. And she understood he meant it as something beyond protocol, but appreciated that he used the word anyway. The barn was finished. Silas had completed it 2 weeks prior and stood looking at it on the day. It was done with the satisfaction of a man who has made something that will last and knows it. The east stall was larger, as promised. The mule had investigated it with the suspicious thoroughness of an animal that does not easily trust improvements made on its behalf, and had eventually accepted it. She came through the east gate. Her preferred approach, he'd noticed, the one that felt like arriving rather than being delivered, and she stopped the horse at the barn and looked at it for a long moment without getting down. "You finished it," she said. "Told you I would." She looked at the east stall through the open barn door. "It's bigger." "You said he needed room." She got down from the horse and handed the reins to Price and walked into the barn and stood in the east stall and looked at the dimensions with the expression she wore when she was confirming something she'd already calculated. The mule watched her from across the barn with the long-suffering attention of an animal that has been through considerable drama recently and is reserving judgment. "Good," she said, to the stall, to the mule, to the barn in general. Price said his formal goodbye at the gate, handshake with Silas, a nod to Vivian that carried more than a nod usually does, and rode back toward Dalton's Creek, and then it was just the ranch, and the animals, and the two of them, and the long, clear November afternoon laying itself out across the Wyoming grass. She stood in the yard and looked around. The repaired cabin, the finished barn, the fence lines running clean to the south and east, the mountains doing their permanent uninterested business to the west. She looked at all of it the way she'd looked at it that first day in the wagon, taking stock, measuring. "The north fence gate," she said. "It's on the list." "Show me where you're putting it." They walked the north fence line in the afternoon, and he showed her the creek crossing and the logical placement, and she agreed with the placement and suggested the gate open inward rather than out, because of the way the creek bank would affect the swing and spring when the ground softened. He hadn't thought of that. He told her so. "You've been running this place alone for too long," she said. Not critically, factually. "I was managing." "You were managing. That's different from running it well." She looked at the creek. "Two people is better for a property this size. The mathematics are straightforward." "The mathematics," he said. "Among other things," she said, and kept walking. Oh. She started at the Carver's Bend School in January. The building had needed work. The stovepipe was badly fitted, and two windows had broken panes that had been stuffed with rags against the previous winter, and the supply of books was inadequate for the age range she was dealing with. She addressed these problems in sequence with the same organized, undeflectable thoroughness she brought to every practical problem, and by the end of the first week the school was functional, and by the end of the first month it was, by the standards of a frontier town school, genuinely good. The children were a range that would have discouraged a different kind of person. Ages 6 through 14 in the same room, mixed levels, some who'd had schooling before, and some who'd had none at all. She differentiated without making the differentiation obvious, which was, Silas gathered from her evening accounts of it, harder than it sounded. She talked about the students the way she talked about most things, precisely and without sentimentality. But underneath the precision was something warmer that came through in the specific details she chose. The boy who was struggling with reading but was extraordinary at arithmetic. The girl who already read at a high level and needed to be given harder material or she'd lose interest. The youngest one, 5 years old and not quite school age, whose mother had nowhere else to put him, and who sat in the corner and drew pictures that Vivian described as surprisingly structured for someone who couldn't yet hold a pencil correctly. She rode to town every morning and back every evening, 12 miles each way. And she did it in January cold and February wind, and the uncertain early spring with the same regularity she brought to everything. Silas worried about the weather more than she did. She pointed out that she was managing the ride and he was not, and that this should settle the question of who was more concerned than the situation required. He didn't agree that he was more concerned than required. He kept that to himself. He built the north gate in March, with her helping on the hinge side because she'd established that she knew about hinges and wasn't going to let that expertise be wasted. The mule watched from the pasture with the expression of an animal formulating a low opinion of the proceedings. In April, on a Saturday afternoon when the work was done and the weather was the first genuinely warm day of the year, Silas asked her to marry him. He did it on the porch, which was where most of the things between them had happened. And he did it without ceremony because ceremony would have been false to both of them, and he did it plainly. He told her that he had been alone a long time by preference and circumstance, and that her being here had changed what the place was and what he was in it, and that he would like her to stay on terms that meant something legally and practically and in every other way. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "I'd like to note that this is not the most romantic proposal I've ever heard of." "I know. I'd also like to note that I'm going to say yes anyway." "I know that too." She looked at him with that direct look, the one he'd stopped trying to decode and started simply receiving. "You knew I was going to say yes." "I hoped," he said. "There's a difference." She considered him for a moment. Then she said yes, properly, and he took her hand, and they sat on the porch in the April sun, and the world continued its business around them, and both of them let it. They were married in June by the Circuit Judge Holloway, who came out from Dalton's Creek for it, and conducted the proceeding with the same sparse efficiency he brought to everything, which suited them both. Martha was there. Boone was there, standing in the back with his hat in his hands, and the look of a man who is unexpectedly moved by something and would prefer not to have it noted. Curtis was there, the cut above his eye long healed to a thin white line that he'd probably carry the rest of his life, and which Vivian said suited him. It was not a large event. There was food afterward at the cabin. Martha had organized this part, which was the right decision. And the afternoon was warm, and the mountains were the mountains, and eventually everyone rode home and left them to the evening. Vivian stood on the porch in the evening light with a coffee she'd made herself, the way she'd made the first one all those weeks ago, and looked at the property. The repaired cabin, the finished barn with its larger east stall, the fence lines running clean, the north gate hanging properly on its hinges. "It needs a garden," she said. "What does?" "The south side of the cabin. It gets morning sun. I want to put a kitchen garden in." He looked at the south side of the cabin. He hadn't thought about it in terms of a garden. He thought about it now. "That's a reasonable use of the space," he said. "I know it is." She looked at him sideways. "I'm going to put in tomatoes, and some herbs, and something that has no practical use at all but that I like, because we're allowed to have things that have no practical use." "We are," he said. "Good." She looked back at the property. "It's a good place," she said. "It was a good place before, but it's different now." He understood what she meant. He felt it too, though he wouldn't have found those specific words for it. A difference in what the land held, what it was for. Not a transaction he could have described while it was happening, only visible from the other side of it. "Yes," he said. The years went by the way years do on a working ranch. Not smoothly, not without difficulty, but with the forward movement of things that are regularly attended to. The garden went in that first summer, and she was right that it got the morning sun, and the tomatoes were good, and she planted something that was, as promised, purely decorative, and turned out to be a tall yellow flower that came back every summer after that without being replanted. She never told him what it was called, and he never asked. The school in Carver's Bend grew. She added students every year as new families came into the area, and in her third year she proposed to the town council that they build a second room, which they eventually agreed to after she presented a written case that was, by all accounts, difficult to argue against. The second room required a second teacher, and she trained that teacher herself, a young woman from Ohio who arrived with a teaching certificate and the specific look of someone who has come west wanting to be somewhere still becoming something. Vivian told her, "The work is daily and the progress is slow, and some days you will wonder if it adds up to anything. It adds up to everything. You just can't always see it from inside the day." The young teacher wrote it down. Silas expanded the ranch, bought the 40 acres to the east when they came available, which gave him a better water access and room for a larger herd. He hired a ranch hand in the fourth year, a quiet Tejano man named Ruiz who was good with cattle and better with horses, and who, after an initial and thorough assessment period, the mule accepted, which Silas considered a more reliable character reference than most. In the fifth year their daughter was born. In the spring, in the cabin, with Martha in attendance and Silas in the kitchen, with the very specific patience of a man who has been told to stay there and intends to honor that instruction while everything in him pulls elsewhere. Martha came out and told him to come in, and he did. And Vivian was exhausted and not done with being exhausted, but present and precise as she always was, the baby in the crook of her arm looking at the ceiling with the unfocused intensity of someone brand new to having eyes. "She's got your stubbornness," Vivian said. "She's 4 minutes old," Silas said. 4 minutes is enough." She looked down at the baby, and something happened in her face that was beyond the range of words he had available. So he just watched it and let it be what it was. "She needs a name." They talked about this. They'd arrived at 2 options and held them in parallel, waiting to see which one fit. "Clara," Vivian said, decided. The way she decided things. He looked at his daughter, at the impossible smallness of her, the hands, the complete and trusting unconsciousness of someone who has arrived somewhere and has not yet had occasion to worry about it. "Clara," he said. It fit. He didn't know why some names fit and others didn't, but this one did. Martha stayed for dinner and rode home in the early evening, and the cabin was quiet again, the 3 of them settling into the new configuration of what they were. Not a transaction or a rescue or a coincidence, but a life. Built from the inside out, one decision at a time, most of them small. There is something worth saying about what it means to be saved by a stranger. Not the dramatic version. Not the moment on the riverbank or the rifle in the dark or the burning barn. Those things happened and they mattered, and they were the hinge points around which the rest turned. But the saving that Vivian Mercer and Silas Granger did for each other was quieter than any of that. It was the kind that happens in the space between 2 people who have decided to be honest about what they need and to show up consistently for what someone else needs, even when it's inconvenient, even when it costs something, even when neither of them is sure what they're building toward. Vivian had survived the river because her body refused to quit. She had survived the weeks after because she was too angry to do otherwise. She had given her testimony and faced Marcia's patient skepticism and held her account intact not because she was brave in the performance sense, but because she understood that accuracy was the only thing she had to offer Eleanor and the others, and she was going to offer it completely. And Silas had found her because he'd been walking in the dark with a lantern for no particular reason and had spent 6 years building a life on a piece of land. He'd arrived at partly by choice and partly by running out of places to go, and had given her the first night and the second night and all the nights after that without requiring anything in return except that she be honest with him, which she was, which turned out to be the specific thing he'd needed from the world without knowing he'd needed it. This is not a lesson that arrives cleanly packaged. It doesn't say, be in the right place at the right time. It doesn't say, the good survive and the evil fall. The world is not that fair. Eleanor did not survive. The child did not survive. 7 people went west on an ordinary stage and did not arrive. That is the weight that sits underneath the rest of this, and it does not go away. What goes on top of the weight is the choice, the daily choosing to build something on honest ground, to show up for what matters, to say the true thing even when the true thing is complicated, to let another person matter to you and bear the vulnerability of that. Vivian taught children for 22 years in Carver's Bend. Some of them she never fully reached. Some of them she changed entirely. Most of them fell somewhere between those two things, the way people do when someone has genuinely tried with them. She never claimed otherwise. Silas ran the ranch for the rest of his working life and handed it, eventually, to Clara and Clara's husband, who had Ruiz's judgment about horses and her mother's organizational certainty and her father's particular patience with things that take time. It became, in time, one of the established ranches in the region. Not the largest, not the most impressive by the measures people sometimes use, but solid, respected, well-run. The kind of place that lasts. On winter evenings, when the weather came in hard from the northwest and the wind had an edge to it that meant real cold was coming, Silas would find Vivian at the table with her coffee and whatever she was reading, and Clara would be asleep in the back room with the trusting completeness of a well-tended child. And the cabin would have the warmth of a fire and 2 people who had made something of their time on this particular piece of ground. He would sit down across from her and she would look up, and sometimes they would talk and sometimes they would not, and both of those things were fine because they had built between them the kind of quiet where not talking was itself a form of saying everything. And sometimes when the wind picked up and the windows rattled and the night outside sounded large and indifferent, the way frontier nights do, he would look at her over the table. This woman who had come out of a river and built a life from the things that were left. And he would think of the muddy bank in the dark, and the lantern, and the way he'd said those 3 words without planning to. He never said them carelessly. He never said them as habit. Every time they meant exactly what they had meant the first time on the dark riverbank, when she was barely conscious, and he didn't know anything about her except that she was alive and in his arms and needed to hear it. You're safe now. And every time, for the rest of their lives, it was true.